The riders came at midnight with torches blazing across the Wyoming plains, and Abigail Mercer knew they weren't coming to talk. She stood barefoot in the doorway of her dying ranch, a loaded rifle trembling in her hands, while her 6-year-old daughter slept behind her, and a stranger from her shattered past stepped out of the darkness, offering one impossible choice: trust him or lose everything before sunrise. What happened next would turn a desperate widow into a legend and prove that sometimes the most dangerous man alive is exactly who you need when the world tries to bury you. If you want to see how far a mother will go when there's nowhere left to run, stay with me until the very end. And when you do, hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story can travel. The wind came down off the mountains like something with teeth. Abigail Mercer stood at the fence line watching the last of the daylight bleed out over the Wyoming plains, her hands raw from pulling fence wire that kept snapping in the cold. The ranch stretched out behind her in every direction. 200 acres of scrub grass, dry creek beds, and broken dreams that used to belong to her husband. Now it belonged to the bank, or it would in less than a week, unless she found money she didn't have and miracles that didn't exist. She wiped her hands on her apron and turned back toward the house. It wasn't much. Weathered timber, a sagging porch, windows that rattled when the wind picked up. But it was hers, the only thing left in the world that still carried Thomas's name on the deed. Clara was sitting on the porch steps when Abigail walked up, her small hands folding a scrap of fabric into some kind of doll. 6 years old and already too quiet for a child, too used to hearing her mother cry through the walls at night. "Mama, is someone coming?" Abigail stopped. "What makes you say that?" Clara pointed toward the ridge. "I saw dust." Abigail's stomach tightened. She followed her daughter's finger and saw it. A thin line of dust rising against the fading sky, maybe 2 miles out. A single rider moving fast. "Go inside," Abigail said. "But now, Clara." The girl scrambled up the steps and disappeared through the door. Abigail stood there a moment longer, her eyes locked on that distant plume of dust. It could be anyone, a drifter looking for work, a traveler needing water, or it could be one of Silas Granger's men, coming to remind her that time was running out. She walked inside and pulled Thomas's rifle down from the wall. The weight of it still felt wrong in her hands, too heavy, too final. She checked the chamber, found it loaded, and set it beside the door. Then she waited. The rider came into view 15 minutes later, moving at a steady gallop across the open plain. Abigail stepped out onto the porch, rifle in hand, and watched him approach. He was tall in the saddle, broad-shouldered, his face shadowed beneath a wide-brimmed hat. He rode like someone who'd spent more time on horseback than on solid ground. And when he finally pulled up at the edge of the yard, his horse was breathing hard but steady. The man dismounted slowly, like he had all the time in the world, and when he turned to face her, Abigail's breath caught in her throat. She knew him. She'd known him 20 years ago, back when the world was a different place and she was a different woman, back before the war, before Thomas, before everything that came after. Abigail. His voice was rougher than she remembered, deeper, like something had worn it down to the bone. Wade Callahan. She didn't lower the rifle. "You've got a lot of nerve showing up here." He took off his hat, ran a hand through dark hair streaked with gray. "I know. What do you want?" "To warn you." She laughed, sharp and bitter. "About what?" "The fact that I'm 3 days away from losing everything. I'm already aware." Wade's eyes flicked to the house, then back to her. "Granger's not waiting 3 days." Abigail's grip tightened on the rifle. "What are you talking about?" "He's sending men tonight, maybe a dozen. They're going to burn you out, take what they want, and make sure you've got nothing left to fight over." The words hit her like a fist to the chest. "How do you know that?" "Because I was in town when he said it." Wade stepped closer, slow and careful, like approaching a spooked horse. He was drinking at the saloon, talking loud enough for everyone to hear. Said he was tired of waiting for the bank to do its job. Said a widow and a little girl don't need 200 acres, and if you won't leave on your own, he'll make sure you don't have a choice. Abigail felt the world tilt beneath her feet. "And you rode all the way out here to tell me?" "I rode all the way out here to help. I don't need your help." "Yeah, you do." His voice was flat, no argument, no apology, just fact. "You've got maybe 2 hours before they show up. You can spend that time hating me, or you can spend it getting ready to survive." She wanted to tell him to leave, wanted to slam the door in his face and pretend she'd never seen him. But the truth was sitting heavy in her chest like a stone, and she couldn't ignore it. She was alone. She was running out of time, and she had no idea how to stop what was coming. "Why?" she asked quietly. "Why do you care?" Wade looked at her for a long moment, something unreadable moving behind his eyes. "Because I know what it's like to lose everything, and because you don't deserve this. You don't know me anymore." "No," he agreed, "but I remember who you used to be." Abigail lowered the rifle, just slightly, and felt something crack open inside her chest. It wasn't trust, not yet, but it was close enough. "If I let you help," she said slowly, "and this goes wrong, I won't forgive you." Wade nodded. "Fair enough." She stepped aside, and he walked past her into the house. The next hour passed in a blur of movement and tension. Wade worked fast, like someone who'd done this before. He checked every window, every door, made sure the shutters could be barred from the inside. He moved furniture to create cover, stacked firewood near the hearth in case they needed something to burn. He didn't talk much, and Abigail didn't ask questions. She just followed his lead, doing what he told her to do, trying not to think too hard about what it meant that she was preparing her home for a war. Clara stayed in the back room, quiet and wide-eyed, clutching her makeshift doll. Abigail checked on her twice, whispered reassurances she didn't believe, and promised everything would be fine. It was a lie, and they both knew it. When the last of the daylight finally died, Wade stood by the window and looked out at the empty plains. "They'll come from the east," he said. "That's where the road is. They'll want to move fast, hit hard, and get out before anyone notices." "How many?" Abigail asked. "Hard to say. Could be 6, could be 20. Depends how serious Granger is." "And if it's 20? Wade didn't answer right away. He just turned to look at her, his face shadowed in the dim light from the oil lamp. "Then we make every shot count." Abigail swallowed hard. "I'm not a killer, Wade. You don't have to be. You just have to be willing to protect what's yours." She looked down at the rifle in her hands, felt the weight of it pressing into her palms. She'd fired it before, back when Thomas was teaching her to hunt, but hunting rabbits was different from shooting at men, different from pulling a trigger knowing it might end someone's life. "I don't know if I can do this," she whispered. Wade crossed the room and stood in front of her. He didn't touch her, didn't try to comfort her, just looked her straight in the eye. "You can. I've seen what you're made of. You're stronger than you think." That was a long time ago. People don't change that much. She wanted to believe him, wanted to believe there was still something inside her that hadn't been hollowed out by grief and exhaustion. But the truth was, she didn't know anymore. Didn't know who she was without Thomas. Didn't know if she was strong enough to stand on her own. "I'm scared," she admitted. "Good," Wade said. "That means you're paying attention." A sound cut through the silence, faint, distant, but unmistakable. Hoofbeats. Wade moved to the window, peered out into the darkness. "Here they come." Abigail's heart slammed against her ribs. She grabbed Clara from the back room, pulled her close, and whispered into her hair. "Stay down, baby. No matter what happens, you stay down." Clara nodded, her small body trembling. Wade extinguished the lamp, plunging the house into darkness. Abigail crouched beside the window, rifle ready, and watched the night. The riders appeared like ghosts out of the blackness, torches blazing in their hands, moving fast across the open ground. She counted them. 7, 8, 10. More than she'd hoped, fewer than she'd feared. They spread out as they approached, forming a loose circle around the house. One of them shouted something Abigail couldn't make out, and the others laughed. Wade's voice was low and steady in the darkness. "When I say go, you shoot at anything that moves. Don't aim for their heads, aim for their center mass, and don't stop until they stop." Abigail's hands were shaking. "What if I miss?" "Then you shoot again." The riders pulled up at the edge of the yard, their torches casting long shadows across the ground. One of them dismounted, a big man with a thick beard and a rifle slung over his shoulder. He took a few steps forward and raised his voice. "Mrs. Mercer, we know you're in there. Mr. Granger sent us to deliver a message." Wade didn't move, didn't respond, just watched. The man took another step. "He says you've had long enough to make up your mind. Time to pack up and move on." Abigail felt rage flare hot in her chest. She wanted to shout back, wanted to tell them to go to hell, but Wade's hand touched her arm, just lightly, holding her in place. "Not yet," he murmured. The big man grinned, ugly and mean. "We'll give you 1 minute to come out. After that, we start burning." Wade counted silently to himself. 5 seconds, 10, 15. Then he raised his rifle, sighted through the window, and fired. The shot cracked through the night like thunder, and the big man went down hard, clutching his leg and screaming. The other riders scattered, shouting, scrambling for cover, and suddenly the darkness exploded into chaos. "Go!" Wade barked. Abigail raised her rifle, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might tear through her chest, and pulled the trigger. The recoil slammed into her shoulder, pain sharp and immediate, but she didn't have time to think about it. She worked the bolt, fired again, saw one of the riders stumble and fall. The torches flew through the air, arcing toward the house, and Wade cursed under his breath. One landed on the roof with a dull thud. Another smashed against the porch and exploded into flame. "They're trying to smoke us out," Wade shouted. "Keep them back!" Abigail fired again and again, her movements automatic now, driven by fear and adrenaline. She couldn't see the faces of the men she was shooting at, couldn't see anything but shadows and fire, and the dark shapes moving through the smoke. One of the riders charged the front door on horseback, and Wade dropped him with a single shot. The horse screamed and bolted, dragging its rider across the ground. The air inside the house was thick with smoke now, burning Abigail's lungs, stinging her eyes. She could hear Clara crying in the back room, and it took everything she had not to run to her, not to abandon the fight and just hold her daughter close. But if she did that, they'd lose. They'd lose everything. So she stayed at the window, reloading, firing, reloading again, until her arms ached and her ears were ringing and she couldn't tell anymore if she was hitting anything or just shooting into the dark. Wade moved through the house like a shadow, firing from different windows, keeping the riders off balance. He was fast, precise, deadly. And for the first time since Thomas died, Abigail felt like maybe, just maybe, they had a chance. But then one of the riders broke through. He came crashing through the side window in a spray of glass and wood, landing hard on the floor and rolling to his feet with a knife in his hand. Abigail spun toward him, but she was too slow. Her rifle tangled in her skirt, and he lunged. Wade was faster. He hit the man like a freight train, slamming him into the wall and driving his fist into the man's face once, twice, 3 times until the man crumpled and didn't move. Wade stood there breathing hard, blood on his knuckles, and looked at Abigail. "You okay?" She nodded, unable to speak. Another gunshot rang out from outside, and Wade swore. "They're regrouping. We need to end this now." He grabbed a lantern from the table, smashed it against the floor, and kicked the burning oil toward the broken window. The flames roared up, creating a wall of fire that sent the riders scrambling back. "Come on!" Wade shouted, grabbing Abigail by the arm and pulling her toward the back door. "We can't stay here." She grabbed Clara, held her tight, and followed Wade out into the night. The cold air hit her like a slap after the heat of the burning house, and for a moment she couldn't breathe, couldn't think. But Wade didn't stop. He led them across the yard, past the barn, into the shadows where the firelight couldn't reach. Behind them, the house burned. Abigail watched it collapse in on itself, watched the flames reach up toward the sky, and felt something inside her break. That was her home, her life. Everything she had left, gone. Wade's hand was still on her arm, steady and firm, and she realized he was saying something, his voice low and urgent. "We need to move. They'll come looking soon." Abigail looked at him, her face streaked with soot and tears, and felt the weight of it all pressing down on her like the sky itself. "Where?" she whispered. "Where do we go?" Wade's jaw tightened. "Somewhere they won't find us. Somewhere we can fight back." She wanted to ask how, wanted to demand answers, wanted to scream at him for bringing this down on her head. But she didn't have the strength, didn't have anything left except the cold weight of Clara in her arms and the bitter taste of smoke on her tongue. So she just nodded and let him lead her into the darkness. Behind them, the ranch burned bright enough to light up the entire valley. And somewhere in the shadows, the riders were already planning their next move. They didn't stop running until the firelight was nothing more than a faint glow on the horizon. Wade led them through the scrub and rock, moving fast despite the darkness, his hand tight around Abigail's wrist like he was afraid she'd disappear if he let go. Clara clung to her mother's neck, silent except for the occasional hiccup of breath that told Abigail she was still crying without making a sound. When they finally reached the old line shack tucked into a draw between two low hills, Wade pushed open the door and pulled them inside. The place smelled like dust and rotting wood, but it was shelter, and right now that was all that mattered. He struck a match and lit a stub of candle he found on a broken shelf. The light flickered across walls that hadn't seen use in years, revealing a single room with a dirt floor and gaps in the roof wide enough to see stars through. Abigail sank down against the wall, still holding Clara, and tried to catch her breath. Her hands were shaking so badly she had to clasp them together to make them stop. Wade crouched in front of her. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head. "No." "You sure?" I said no. He studied her face for a moment, then nodded and stood up. He moved to the door, peered out into the darkness, then came back and sat down across from her. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Clara had finally stopped crying, her small body limp with exhaustion against Abigail's chest. Abigail stroked her daughter's hair and tried not to think about the house, tried not to picture the flames eating through the walls, the roof collapsing, everything Thomas had built turning to ash. "They'll come looking," Wade said quietly. Abigail looked up at him. "I know. We can't stay here long." "I know that too." Wade leaned back against the wall, his rifle resting across his knees. His face was streaked with soot, his knuckles raw and bleeding from where he'd hit that man, and there was a long cut across his jaw that Abigail hadn't noticed before. "You're bleeding," she said. He touched his face, looked at the blood on his fingers like he hadn't realized it was there. "It's nothing. Let me see." "Abigail, let me see." He sighed and leaned forward. Abigail shifted Clara gently to the side, then reached out and turned Wade's face toward the candlelight. The cut wasn't deep, but it was angry and still bleeding. "You need to clean that," she said. "With what?" She pulled a strip of fabric from the hem of her dress, wet it with water from the canteen Wade had brought, and pressed it against the wound. He flinched but didn't pull away. "You didn't have to come back," Abigail said quietly. "You could have just stayed in town, let this all happen without getting involved." Wade's eyes met hers. "Yeah, I could have. So why didn't you?" He was quiet for a moment, his jaw tight beneath her hand. "Because I owed you." "You don't owe me anything." "That's not how I see it." Abigail finished cleaning the cut and pulled her hand back. "What happened back then wasn't your fault, Wade. You didn't choose to leave." "No, but I chose not to come back." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with things that hadn't been said in 20 years. Abigail looked away. "That was a long time ago." "Doesn't make it any less true." She didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing. Just sat there in the flickering candlelight, listening to Clara's soft breathing and the wind moving through the gaps in the walls. After a while, Wade spoke again. "What do you know about Granger?" Abigail shook her head. "Not much. He owns half the businesses in town, bought up land from people who couldn't pay their debts. Thomas used to say he was building an empire." "He's worse than that," Wade said. "He's building a kingdom, and he doesn't just want the land. He wants everyone to know he can take it whenever he wants." "Then why target me? I'm nobody." "That's exactly why. Because if he can crush a widow and a little girl, nobody else will dare stand up to him." Abigail felt anger flare hot in her chest. "So I'm just a message." "To him, yeah, but you don't have to be." She looked at him sharply. "What's that supposed to mean?" Wade leaned forward, his voice low and urgent. "You think those men are going to give up just because your house burned? They're going to keep coming until they finish what they started. And when they do, every other family in this valley is going to see what happens when you can't fight back." "So what are you saying? That I should fight?" "I'm saying you don't have a choice. Not unless you want to spend the rest of your life running." Abigail's throat tightened. "I don't know how to do this, Wade. I'm not a fighter." "You were tonight. That was different. That was survival." "So is this," Wade said. "The only difference is how long it lasts." She wanted to argue with him, wanted to tell him he was wrong, that there had to be another way. But the truth was sitting heavy in her chest, and she couldn't ignore it. He was right. Running wouldn't save her. Hiding wouldn't save her. The only thing that might save her was standing her ground and making it cost too much for Granger to keep pushing. "Even if I wanted to fight," she said slowly, "I don't have anything left to fight with. No house, no money, no help. Wade's eyes didn't waver. You've got me. One man. One man who knows how to hurt people like Granger. Abigail studied his face, trying to read what was behind those words. What did you do after you left, Wade? Where did you go? He looked away. Places you don't want to know about. Try me. He was quiet for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice was flat and distant. I joined the cavalry, spent 10 years chasing down raiders and putting bullets in men who probably didn't deserve it. After that, I drifted. Took jobs where I could find them. Some of them were legal, most weren't. So you became a killer. I became whatever I needed to be to survive. Abigail felt something twist in her chest. This wasn't the boy she'd known all those years ago. That boy had been reckless and wild, but there'd been something bright in him, something hopeful. The man sitting across from her now was harder, colder, like the world had beaten all the light out of him. Do you regret it? She asked. Wade met her eyes. Every day. Then why keep doing it? Because it's all I know how to do. The candle flickered, casting shadows across his face, and Abigail saw something in his expression that made her breath catch. It wasn't anger or violence or any of the things she expected. It was loneliness. You could walk away, she said quietly. Right now. Leave me here. Go back to wherever you came from and forget any of this happened. Wade shook his head. No, I couldn't. Why not? Because I already tried that once, and it didn't work. Abigail's chest tightened. She wanted to ask what he meant, wanted to pull the truth out of him, but Clara stirred in her arms and let out a small whimper, and the moment broke. She needs to sleep, Abigail murmured. Wade stood up and moved to the door. I'll keep watch. You get some rest. Wade, we'll figure out the rest in the morning, he said without turning around. Right now, just sleep. Abigail didn't have the energy to argue. She curled up against the wall with Clara tucked against her chest and closed her eyes. But sleep didn't come easy. Every time she started to drift off, she saw the house burning, saw the riders circling in the darkness, saw the man crashing through the window with a knife in his hand. And when she finally did fall asleep, she dreamed of fire. She woke to the sound of voices. For a moment, she didn't know where she was. Then it all came rushing back. The attack, the flight, the line shack. She sat up quickly, her heart hammering, and looked around. Wade was standing at the door, his rifle raised, his body tense. Outside, she could hear men talking, their voices carrying across the still morning air. How many? She whispered. 3. Maybe 4. Are they Granger's men? Yeah. Abigail's stomach dropped. She looked down at Clara, still asleep, and felt panic claw at her throat. What do we do? Wade glanced back at her. Stay quiet. Don't move. The voices grew louder, closer. Abigail could make out words now. They came this way, I'm telling you. I saw tracks. You see tracks everywhere, Hank. Doesn't mean they're here. Then where the hell are they? Could be anywhere. This whole valley's full of holes to hide in. Abigail held her breath as the footsteps approached the shack. Through the gaps in the walls, she could see the shapes of men moving past, their rifles slung over their shoulders. One of them stopped right outside the door. What about this place? That old thing? Nobody's used it in years. Doesn't hurt to check. Abigail's hand found Clara's mouth, covering it gently, and she pulled her daughter close. Wade shifted his weight, his finger on the trigger, ready. The door creaked as someone pushed on it from the outside. Abigail's heart slammed against her ribs. The door swung open, and a man stepped inside, his eyes adjusting to the darkness. He was young, maybe 20, with a scraggly beard and a nervous energy that made him twitch. He didn't see them at first. His eyes swept the room, landing on the broken shelf, the dirt floor, the extinguished candle. Then his gaze found Wade. For a split second, nobody moved. Then the young man opened his mouth to shout, and Wade lunged. He hit the man hard, driving him back through the door and out into the dirt. The rifle went flying, and Wade's fist connected with the man's jaw with a sound like breaking wood. Outside, the other men started shouting. Move! Wade barked at Abigail. Now! She grabbed Clara and ran, stumbling out of the shack and into the blinding morning light. Wade was still on top of the young man, hitting him again and again until he stopped moving, and then he was on his feet, grabbing his rifle, pulling Abigail by the arm. Gunshots cracked through the air, kicking up dirt at their feet. They ran. Wade led them up the slope, away from the shack, weaving between rocks and scrub. Abigail's lungs burned, her legs screaming with every step, but she didn't stop. Couldn't stop. Clara was crying now, her small voice lost in the chaos, and Abigail held her tighter, whispering things she didn't even hear herself. More gunshots. Closer this time. Wade spun around, dropped to one knee, and fired. One of the men behind them went down hard. "Keep going," he shouted. Abigail ran until she thought her legs would give out, until the world narrowed down to nothing but the sound of her own breathing and the weight of Clara in her arms. And then, suddenly, they were in cover. Wade pulled her down behind a cluster of boulders, breathing hard, his face slick with sweat. He peered over the top, fired once, twice, then ducked back down. "How many?" Abigail gasped. "Two left, but they've got the high ground now." "So what do we do?" Wade reloaded his rifle, his movements fast and automatic. "We wait for them to make a mistake. And if they don't?" He didn't answer. The minutes stretched out, taut and brittle. Abigail could hear the men moving out there, circling, trying to flank them. She clutched Clara close and tried to think of a prayer, but the words wouldn't come. Wade fired again, and someone screamed. Then silence. Wade waited, his rifle still raised, his eyes scanning the slope. After what felt like forever, he lowered the gun and let out a breath. "They're pulling back." Abigail's head swam with relief. "Are you sure?" "Yeah, they're not stupid. They know if they push too hard, they're the ones who'll end up dead." She sagged against the rock, her whole body trembling. "How long can we keep doing this?" Wade looked at her, his expression hard. "As long as we have to." "That's not an answer. It's the only one I've got." Abigail closed her eyes, exhaustion crashing over her like a wave. She was so tired, tired of running, tired of fighting, tired of being afraid. But when she opened her eyes again, Wade was still there, still watching her, and she realized something. She wasn't alone. For better or worse, she wasn't alone. They stayed in the rocks until midday, waiting to make sure Granger's men were really gone. When Wade finally signaled that it was safe to move, they started walking. Abigail didn't ask where they were going. She just followed. They moved west, skirting the edge of the valley, staying off the main roads. Clara had stopped crying, but she hadn't spoken either, and Abigail could feel the weight of her daughter's fear pressing against her chest like a stone. By the time the sun started to sink toward the horizon, Abigail's feet were blistered and raw, and every step felt like walking on broken glass. But she didn't complain, didn't ask to stop. Wade led them to a narrow canyon where a thin stream ran between the rocks, and there they made camp. Abigail sat down by the water and let Clara drink from her cupped hands. The girl's face was pale, her eyes red-rimmed and hollow. "Are we going to be okay, Mama?" Clara whispered. Abigail's throat tightened. "Yes, baby. We're going to be okay." It was a lie, and they both knew it. Wade built a small fire, just enough to take the edge off the cold, and they sat in silence as the darkness closed in around them. After a while, Clara fell asleep curled up in Abigail's lap, and Abigail finally let herself look at Wade across the fire. "What happens now?" she asked. Wade poked at the flames with a stick. "We keep moving. Stay ahead of them until we figure out a plan." "That's not a plan. That's just running." "Sometimes running is all you've got." Abigail shook her head. "No, I'm done running." Wade looked up sharply. "Abigail." "I mean it," she said, her voice stronger now. "I'm done letting him chase me, done letting him take everything I have." "Then what do you want to do?" She met his eyes across the fire. "I want to fight back." Wade was quiet for a long moment, studying her face. "You know what that means, right? If we go after Granger, there's no walking away from it, no second chances." "I know." "You could die." "I could die running too," Abigail said. "At least this way I go down swinging." A slow smile tugged at the corner of Wade's mouth. "You always were stubborn." "Yeah, well, some things don't change." Wade leaned back, his eyes still on her. "All right, if that's what you want, I'll help you, but we do this smart. We don't go charging in like fools." "So what do we do?" "We hit him where it hurts," Wade said. "His money, his reputation, his power. We make him bleed until he's the one who's afraid." Abigail felt something stir in her chest. Not hope, exactly, but something close. "How?" she asked. Wade's smile widened, sharp and dangerous. Leave that to me. They talked late into the night, their voices low so as not to wake Clara. Wade laid out the plan, piece by piece, and with every word, Abigail felt the fear inside her shift into something else. Anger, determination, a fierce, burning need to make Silas Granger pay for what he'd done. By the time the fire burned down to embers, Abigail felt like a different woman than the one who'd stood on her porch just 2 nights ago. That woman had been broken, afraid, ready to give up. This woman was ready to burn the whole valley down if that's what it took. Wade stood up and stretched, his joints popping. We should get some sleep. Tomorrow's going to be a long day. Abigail nodded, but she didn't move. She just sat there, staring into the dying fire, Clara warm and safe in her arms. Wade paused at the edge of the firelight. You sure about this, Abigail? Once we start, there's no going back. She looked up at him, her eyes hard. I'm sure. He nodded slowly. Good, because I wasn't planning on going back either. And with that, he disappeared into the darkness, leaving Abigail alone with her daughter and the cold wind and the quiet, burning certainty that everything was about to change. They moved at first light, before the sun had fully cleared the eastern mountains. Wade had Clara on his shoulders, the girl's small hands gripping his hat while Abigail walked beside them with Thomas's rifle slung across her back. Her feet still hurt, her body ached from sleeping on hard ground, but she pushed through it. There wasn't time for weakness anymore. Where are we going? Clara asked, her voice small in the morning quiet. Somewhere safe, Wade said. Will there be food? Yeah, sweetheart, there'll be food. Abigail glanced at him. They both knew that was probably a lie, but Clara didn't need to know that yet. They followed the canyon west for 2 hours before it opened up into a wider valley dotted with pine and aspen. Wade led them through the trees, moving carefully, always watching the ridgelines for signs of movement. Around mid-morning, they came to a place where the land dropped away into a shallow basin, and at the bottom sat a cluster of buildings that looked like they'd been forgotten by the world. Old mining camp, Abigail realized, abandoned years ago when the silver ran out. That's where we're going? She asked. Wade nodded. Nobody comes out here anymore. We can rest, get our bearings, figure out the next move. And if Granger's men find us, they won't. Not unless we let them. Abigail didn't argue. She was too tired to argue. They made their way down into the basin, and as they got closer, Abigail could see that the camp was in worse shape than she'd thought. Most of the buildings had collapsed in on themselves, roofs caved in, walls rotted through. But there was one structure still standing, a small cabin tucked against the hillside with a solid door and intact windows. Wade pushed the door open, stepped inside, and looked around. It'll do. Abigail followed him in, Clara still clinging to her hand. The cabin was dim and dusty, but it was dry, and there was a fireplace that looked like it might still work. A table and 2 chairs sat in one corner, and a narrow cot was pushed against the far wall. You and Clara take the cot, Wade said. I'll sleep on the floor. Abigail set down her rifle and sank into one of the chairs. Her legs felt like they might give out if she stood any longer. We can't just hide here, Wade. Sooner or later, we have to do something. I know. So what's the plan? Wade set Clara down gently, then moved to the window and looked out at the empty camp. Granger's got power because people are afraid of him. We take that away. He's got nothing. How do we take it away? We make him look weak, Wade said. We hit him where everyone can see, and we make sure they know he couldn't stop us. Abigail leaned forward. You're talking about the town. I'm talking about the bank. Her breath caught. You want to rob Silas Granger's bank? Not rob, disrupt. We go in, make a scene, show everyone that he's not untouchable. Wade turned to face her. People only follow men like Granger because they think they have to. The second they see him bleed, that changes. And what if they just see us as outlaws? Criminals? Then we make sure they see the truth first. Wade crossed the room and crouched in front of her. You think you're the only one he's done this to? You think your ranch was the first place he burned? There are families all over this valley who've lost everything to him, and they're all too scared to say anything. So we say it for them. Exactly. Abigail chewed her lip, thinking it through. It was reckless, dangerous, the kind of plan that could get them both killed. But it might also work. When? She asked. 3 days. That gives us time to scout, to prepare, and to make sure Clara's somewhere safe. At the mention of her name, Clara looked up from where she'd been sitting on the floor. Mama, I'm hungry. Abigail's chest tightened. I know, baby. Wade stood up and pulled a small cloth bundle from his coat. I've got some jerky. It's not much, but it'll help. He handed it to Clara, who took it with both hands and started chewing. Abigail watched her daughter eat and felt something crack inside her chest. This wasn't the life she'd wanted for Clara. This wasn't the future she'd imagined when she held her as a newborn and whispered promises about safety and happiness and all the things a mother tells her child. But it was the life they had. And if Abigail didn't do something to change it, Clara would grow up knowing her mother had been too afraid to fight back. All right, Abigail said quietly. 3 days. We'd do this. Wade nodded. Then we'd better get started. The next 2 days passed in a blur of preparation. Wade taught Abigail how to move quietly, how to read the land, how to spot danger before it spotted her. He showed her how to reload the rifle faster, how to steady her breathing before she pulled the trigger, how to shoot without thinking. You can't hesitate, Piton, he told her one afternoon as they practiced behind the cabin. The second you start questioning whether you can pull that trigger, you're already dead. Abigail raised the rifle, sighted on a distant tree, and fired. The shot went wide. Damn it! Again. She reloaded, fired, missed again. Wade stepped up behind her, his hands on her shoulders, adjusting her stance. You're tensing up. Relax your grip. Let the rifle do the work. Abigail tried again. This time the shot hit the tree, splintering bark. Better, Wade said. She lowered the rifle, her arm shaking from the effort. I'm never going to be as good as you. You don't have to be. You just have to be good enough. That night, after Claire had fallen asleep on the cot, Abigail sat by the fire and watched Wade sharpen his knife. The sound of steel on stone filled the silence, rhythmic and hypnotic. Can I ask you something? Abigail said. Wade didn't look up. Sure. Why did you really come back? He paused, the knife halfway down the stone. I told you. I owed you. That's not the whole truth. Wade set the knife down and looked at her across the fire. What do you want me to say, Abigail? I want you to tell me the truth. He was quiet for a long time, his jaw working like he was chewing on words he didn't want to swallow. Finally, he spoke. I came back because I've spent the last 20 years trying to forget you, and it didn't work. Abigail's breath caught. I left because I thought it was the right thing to do, Wade continued. Thought you deserved better than some kid with no future and a head full of bad ideas. And then I heard you'd married Thomas, and I told myself it was for the best, that you'd be happy, that you'd have the life I couldn't give you. I was happy, Abigail said quietly. Thomas was a good man. I know he was. That's why I stayed away. Wade leaned forward, his eyes locked on hers. But when I heard what happened to him, and then heard what Granger was doing to you, I couldn't just sit in some saloon and pretend I didn't care. Because I do care. I always have. Abigail felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, and she blinked them back. You can't say things like that, Wade. Why not? Because it doesn't change anything. Thomas is gone. My life is what it is. And after this is over, you'll leave again, and I'll be right back where I started. Wade shook his head. Not if you don't want me to. The words hung in the air between them, heavy and impossible. Abigail looked away, her throat tight. I don't know what I want anymore. Then we'll figure it out when this is over, Wade said, one step at a time. On the third day, they left Clara with an older woman named Ruth, who lived alone on the far edge of the valley. Ruth had lost her own husband to Granger's men years ago, and when Wade explained what they were planning, she didn't ask questions. She just pulled Clara into her arms and promised to keep her safe. Abigail held her daughter tight before letting her go, whispering promises she wasn't sure she could keep. I'll come back for you, baby. I promise. Clara's eyes were wide and scared. What if you don't? I will, Abigail said, forcing her voice to stay steady. I will. And then she turned and walked away before she could change her mind. They reached the town just after sunset. It was a small place, barely more than a main street lined with clapboard buildings and a few side roads that petered out into nothing. The bank sat at the far end, a squat brick structure with barred windows and a heavy door. Wade and Abigail watched it from the shadows of an alley across the street, studying the patterns, counting the number of men who came and went. Granger's got 2 guards inside, Wade murmured. Maybe 3, and he'll be in his office upstairs. How do you know? Because men like him always want to be able to see what's happening below. Abigail's hands were slick with sweat. What if this doesn't work? Then we improvise. That's not reassuring. Wade glanced at her, a faint smile tugging at his mouth. You want reassuring? You picked the wrong partner. Despite herself, Abigail almost laughed. Almost. They waited until the street was mostly empty, just a few stragglers making their way home from the saloon. Then Wade nodded, and they moved. They crossed the street quickly, keeping to the shadows, and Wade tried the bank's front door. Locked, as expected. He pulled a thin piece of metal from his pocket and worked it into the lock, his movements fast and practiced. The lock clicked, and the door swung open. Inside, the bank was dark, except for a single lamp burning behind the counter. Abigail's heart was hammering so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. Wade moved toward the back, motioning for her to follow. They made it halfway across the room before a voice cut through the silence. Stop right there. Abigail froze. A man stepped out from behind the counter, a rifle pointed at Wade's chest. He was older, gray-haired, with a face like carved stone. You're making a big mistake, the man said. Wade's hand moved slowly toward his gun. We're not here to rob you. Then what are you here for? Justice, Wade said. The man's eyes flicked to Abigail, then back to Wade. Justice. That's a fancy word for revenge. Call it whatever you want, Wade said. But Silas Granger has been bleeding this valley dry for years, and somebody needs to stop him. The man's grip on the rifle didn't waver. And you think breaking into his bank is going to accomplish that? I think it's a start. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then, slowly, the man lowered his rifle. You've got guts, I'll give you that, he said. But guts won't keep you alive when Granger finds out what you've done. We'll deal with that when it happens, Wade said. The man shook his head. You're both going to get yourselves killed. Probably, Abigail said. But at least we'll die standing up. The man studied her face, something shifting in his expression. You're the Mercer widow, aren't you? The one whose ranch burned. Abigail lifted her chin. That's right. I heard about that. Heard Granger sent his men out there to run you off. The man sighed, long and heavy. I'm sorry. Your husband was a good man. He was, Abigail said, and he didn't deserve what happened to him. The man looked at her for another moment, then stepped aside. Granger's office is upstairs, second door on the left. Safe's behind the painting of the mountains. Wade frowned. Why are you helping us? Because I'm tired of watching good people lose everything while men like Granger get richer, the man said. And because if someone doesn't stand up to him soon, there won't be anything left worth saving. Wade nodded slowly. Thank you. The man waved him off. Don't thank me yet. You still have to get out of here alive. They climbed the stairs quickly, their footsteps muffled by the worn carpet. At the top, Wade paused, listening, then moved to the second door and pushed it open. Granger's office was exactly what Abigail expected. Heavy desk, leather chairs, walls lined with books that probably hadn't been read. And behind the desk, the painting of the mountains. Wade pulled it aside, revealing the safe, and knelt in front of it. He pressed his ear against the metal, his fingers working the dial. Abigail stood by the door, her rifle ready, her ears straining for any sound from below. How long is this going to take? She whispered. As long as it takes, Wade muttered. The seconds stretched into minutes. Abigail's hands were shaking again, her breath coming in short, shallow bursts. Then the safe clicked, and Wade pulled the door open. Inside were stacks of cash, deeds to properties all over the valley, and a ledger bound in black leather. Wade grabbed the ledger and flipped it open, his eyes scanning the pages. This is it. Every shady deal he's ever made, every family he's cheated, every piece of land he stole. We take that, and we have proof, Abigail said. We take this, and we have a weapon. Wade stuffed the ledger into his coat, grabbed a handful of cash, and closed the safe. Let's go. They were halfway down the stairs when the front door burst open. Granger stood in the doorway, flanked by 4 armed men, his face twisted with rage. I knew you'd be stupid enough to come here, Granger snarled. Wade pushed Abigail behind him, his hand on his gun. We're leaving, Granger. Don't make this worse than it has to be. Worse? Granger laughed, cold and sharp. You burned down half my operation, killed my men, and now you've broken into my bank. You think it can get worse? Yeah, Wade said. I do. He drew his gun and fired in one smooth motion, hitting the man to Granger's left square in the chest. The others scrambled for cover, and Wade grabbed Abigail's hand and pulled her toward the back of the building. Gunfire erupted behind them, bullets slamming into the walls and sending plaster raining down. Wade kicked open a door, and they burst out into the alley behind the bank. "Run!" he shouted. They ran through the darkness, feet pounding against dirt, lungs burning. Behind them, Granger's men were already giving chase, their shouts echoing off the buildings. Wade pulled Abigail down a side street, then another, weaving through the town like he'd memorized every corner. They ducked behind a stack of crates, pressed flat against the wall, and waited. Footsteps thundered past. Wade counted to 10, then motioned for her to move. They slipped out of the alley and made for the edge of town where their horses were waiting. But as they reached the horses, more men appeared, cutting off their escape. Wade swore under his breath. "This way!" He led her toward the old livery stable, pushed the door open, and pulled her inside. The place smelled like rotting hay and horse sweat, and the darkness was absolute. "Wade, shh." They crouched behind a pile of feed sacks, listening as the men searched outside. Voices called back and forth, growing louder, then fading. Abigail's heart was beating so hard she thought it might explode. Wade's hand found hers in the darkness, his grip strong and steady. "We're going to be okay." "You don't know that." "I know we've made it this far." The voices outside grew distant, and finally, silence. Wade waited another minute, then stood up slowly. "Come on, we need to move before they double back." They slipped out of the livery and made their way to the horses. This time, nobody stopped them. They rode hard through the night, putting as much distance as they could between themselves and the town. The ledger was pressed against Wade's chest, the proof of everything Granger had done, and Abigail could feel the weight of it like a stone in her gut. They'd done it. They'd actually done it. But as the adrenaline started to fade, reality set in. Granger would come after them now, with everything he had, and there was nowhere left to hide. They stopped just before dawn, the horses lathered and exhausted. Wade dismounted and pulled Abigail down beside him, his hands on her shoulders. "You did good back there," he said. Abigail shook her head. "I almost got us killed." "But you didn't. We're still here." She looked up at him, and for the first time in days, she felt something other than fear. She felt proud. "What now?" she asked. Wade pulled the ledger from his coat and held it up. "Now we show the world who Silas Granger really is, and we make sure everyone knows he can't hide behind his money anymore." "And if he kills us before we get the chance?" Wade's smile was sharp and dangerous. "Then we make damn sure he goes down with us." Abigail felt a laugh bubble up in her chest, wild and breathless. It was insane, all of it. But for the first time since Thomas died, she felt like she was actually fighting for something, not just surviving, fighting. "All right," she said. "Let's finish this." They mounted up and rode toward the eastern hills where the sun was just starting to rise over the valley. Behind them, the town was waking up to the news that someone had finally stood up to Silas Granger. And ahead of them, somewhere in the wilderness, Clara was waiting. Abigail thought about her daughter's face, the way she'd looked so small and scared when Abigail left her with Ruth. She thought about the promises she'd made, the ones she wasn't sure she could keep. And she thought about Wade, riding beside her, this man who'd come back from the past and turned her world upside down. She didn't know what was going to happen next, didn't know if they'd survive the week. But she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't running anymore. When they reached the ridge overlooking the valley, Wade pulled his horse to a stop and looked back at the town below. Smoke was already rising from the bank, black and thick against the morning sky. "Looks like Granger's cleaning up the mess," Wade said, "or covering his tracks. Either way, people are going to start asking questions, and when they do, we'll be ready to give them answers." Abigail looked out at the valley, at the land that had taken so much from her, and felt something settle deep in her chest. This was her home, and she wasn't letting anyone take it from her ever again. "Let's go get Clara," she said. Wade nodded, and they rode down into the valley together, the morning light stretching out before them like a promise. They found Ruth's cabin just as the sun cleared the mountains, casting long shadows across the scrubland. Clara was sitting on the porch steps when they rode up. And the moment she saw Abigail, she was running. Abigail barely had time to dismount before her daughter crashed into her arms, sobbing so hard her whole body shook. "Mama, Mama, I thought you weren't coming back." Abigail held her tight, burying her face in Clara's hair. "I'm here, baby. I'm here." Ruth appeared in the doorway, her weathered face tight with worry. "You two look like hell." "We've had better days," Wade said, swinging down from his horse. "Did you get what you went for?" Wade patted his coat where the ledger was hidden. "Yeah, we got it." Ruth's eyes narrowed. "Then you know Granger's going to come after you with everything he's got." "Let him," Abigail said, still holding Clara. "We're done running." Ruth looked at her for a long moment, something like respect flickering in her eyes. "You've changed, girl." "I had to." Ruth stepped aside. "Come in. You both need food and rest before you do anything else stupid." Inside the small cabin, Ruth set about making coffee and frying up what little bacon she had. Wade sat at the table with the ledger spread open in front of him, his finger tracing down the columns of names and numbers. Abigail sat beside Clara, who refused to let go of her hand. "What's in there?" Abigail asked, nodding at the ledger. Wade didn't look up. "Proof. Every family he's stolen from. Every piece of land he took under false pretenses. Every loan he called in early to force people out." He flipped a page, his jaw tightening. "There are names in here I recognize, good people, dead now, most of them." "So what do we do with it?" "We show it to everyone," Wade said. "We make copies, spread them across the valley, make sure every person who lost something to Granger knows exactly what he did." Ruth set a cup of coffee in front of him. "That's a good way to start a war." "War's already started," Wade said. "We're just making sure people know which side they're on." Ruth grunted. "And when Granger finds out you're still alive and spreading his secrets all over creation, what then?" Wade finally looked up. "Then he'll come for us. And we'll be ready." Abigail felt Clara's grip tighten on her hand. She looked down at her daughter's pale face and made a decision. "Clara's not staying anywhere near this," Abigail said. "Ruth, is there someone farther out who could take her? Somewhere Granger would never think to look?" Ruth considered this. "My sister lives 2 days' ride north, up in the mountains. Granger doesn't have any business up there." "Will she take her?" "She will if I ask." Abigail's throat tightened. She looked at Clara, saw the fear in her daughter's eyes, and hated herself for what she was about to do. But keeping Clara safe mattered more than anything else. "Baby, you're going to go stay with Ruth's sister for a little while." "No." Clara's voice was small but firm. "I want to stay with you." "I know you do, but it's not safe here." "It wasn't safe before either, and you came back." Abigail felt tears prick at her eyes. "This is different." "Why?" "Because this time, the bad men know where we are, and they're going to keep coming until someone stops them." Clara's lower lip trembled. "Then I want to help." "You are helping," Abigail said gently. "By being safe. By letting me do what I need to do without worrying about you every second." Clara looked at her for a long moment, then threw her arms around Abigail's neck and started crying again. Abigail held her, feeling her own tears spill over, and wondered if she was making the right choice. Wade reached across the table and put his hand over Abigail's. She looked up at him, and he nodded once, steady and sure. It didn't make letting go any easier. 2 hours later, Ruth set off with Clara on the back of her horse, heading north toward the mountains. Abigail stood in the yard and watched them disappear over the ridge, her heart feeling like it had been torn out of her chest. Wade stood beside her, silent. "I should have gone with her," Abigail said quietly. "No, you shouldn't have." "She needs me." "She needs you alive," Wade said. "And the only way to make sure she stays safe is to make sure Granger can't hurt anyone ever again." Abigail wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "What if we fail?" "Then at least Clara will be far away when it happens." It wasn't comforting, but it was honest, and Abigail appreciated that. They spent the rest of the day making copies of the ledger's most damning pages. Wade had brought paper and ink from the bank, and they worked in silence, transcribing names and dates and dollar amounts until Abigail's hand cramped and her eyes burned. When they were finished, they had a dozen pages of evidence, each one detailing a different crime Granger had committed over the years. "Now what?" Abigail asked. "Now we deliver them," Wade said. "To the families who lost everything. To the people who thought they were alone. And if they don't believe us, they will, because it's all there in black and white, written in Granger's own hand. That night, they rode to the first homestead on the list, a small farm on the eastern edge of the valley. The family who lived there, the Hendersons, had lost their land 3 years ago when Granger called in a loan early. They'd been forced to work as tenant farmers on property that used to be theirs. Wade knocked on the door, and when Mr. Henderson answered, his face went pale. "You're the ones who hit the bank," he said. Wade nodded. "We are, and we brought you something." He handed Henderson one of the copied pages. The man took it, his hand shaking, and read it by the light of the oil lamp. His face went from pale to red. "That bastard! That lying, thieving bastard!" His wife appeared behind him. "What is it, John?" "It's proof," Henderson said, his voice shaking with rage. "Proof that Granger cheated us, that he had no legal right to call in that loan when he did." Mrs. Henderson took the paper, read it, and started crying. "I'm sorry," Abigail said quietly. "I know it doesn't change what happened, but at least now you know the truth." Henderson looked at Wade. "What are you planning to do with this?" "We're spreading it across the valley, making sure everyone knows what he's done." "And then what?" "Then we see how many people are willing to stand up to him." Henderson was quiet for a moment, then he straightened his shoulders. "Count me in." Over the next 2 days, they visited a dozen families. Some cried, some raged. A few were too broken to do anything but stare at the paper in silence. But almost all of them said the same thing: "Count me in." By the third day, word had spread across the valley like wildfire. People were talking, meeting in barns and kitchens and back rooms, showing each other the papers, sharing stories of what Granger had done to them. And Silas Granger was starting to notice. Abigail and Wade were camped in the ruins of the old mining camp when they saw the riders coming. There were at least 20 of them, moving fast across the valley floor, headed straight for the basin. Wade grabbed his rifle. "They found us!" Abigail's stomach dropped. "How?" "Doesn't matter. We need to move. Now!" They saddled the horses in seconds, but by the time they mounted up, the riders were already entering the basin, spreading out to cut off the exits. Wade swore under his breath. "We're not getting out of here without a fight." Abigail's hands were shaking as she checked her rifle. "How many bullets do you have?" "Not enough." The riders pulled up at the edge of the camp, and Silas Granger himself stepped forward, his face twisted with fury. "You've caused me a lot of trouble, Callahan," Granger shouted, "but it ends here." Wade raised his rifle. "You want to come take me, Granger? Or are you going to hide behind your men like you always do?" Granger's face went even redder. "Kill them both." The riders raised their guns, and Wade fired first. The battle exploded across the basin in a hail of gunfire and screaming horses. Abigail fired again and again, her heart hammering, her hands steady despite the fear clawing at her chest. Wade was beside her, calm and lethal, dropping men with every shot. But there were too many. Abigail felt a bullet whistle past her ear, felt another one slam into the ground at her feet. She ducked behind a collapsed building, reloading, and saw Wade take a hit to the shoulder. He went down hard, blood spreading across his shirt. "Wade!" Abigail ran to him, dragging him behind cover, her hands pressing against the wound. Blood poured between her fingers, hot and slick, and Wade's face was white with pain. "I'm okay," he gasped. "I'm okay." "You're not okay. You're bleeding everywhere." "Doesn't matter. Keep shooting." But Abigail couldn't. She couldn't leave him like this, couldn't watch him bleed out while she fought. She tore a strip from her sleeve and pressed it against the wound, trying to stop the bleeding. Wade hissed in pain but didn't pull away. "Abigail, listen to me," he said, his voice strained. "You need to get out of here." "I'm not leaving you." "You have to, for Clara." "No." "Abigail." "I said no." She grabbed her rifle, stood up, and fired at the nearest rider. He went down, and she fired again and again, her vision narrowing to nothing but targets and triggers. She didn't think, didn't feel, just fought. And somewhere in the chaos, something shifted. The riders started falling back, their numbers thinning, their confidence wavering. Abigail didn't know if it was because she and Wade had killed enough of them, or because they'd realized this fight was going to cost more than Granger was willing to pay. But they were retreating. Granger screamed at them to hold their ground, but his men were already turning their horses, already riding back the way they'd come. And then, suddenly, it was over. Abigail stood there, breathing hard, her rifle still raised, surrounded by bodies and smoke and the ringing silence that comes after gunfire. Wade was slumped against the wall behind her, his hand pressed to his shoulder, his face pale but alive. "Did we win?" he asked weakly. Abigail looked around at the carnage, at the dead men scattered across the basin, and felt something cold settle in her chest. "I don't know," she said. She knelt beside Wade and checked the wound. The bullet had gone clean through, which was good, but he'd lost a lot of blood. "We need to get you somewhere safe," she said. "Somewhere I can patch you up properly." Wade nodded, too weak to argue. Abigail helped him onto his horse, then mounted her own. They rode slowly out of the basin, leaving the dead behind, and headed west toward the only place Abigail could think of, the Caldwell Ranch. The Caldwells were one of the families they'd visited, and Mrs. Caldwell had promised that if Abigail ever needed help, her door would be open. It was a 2-hour ride, and by the time they arrived, Wade was barely conscious. Abigail pounded on the door, and Mrs. Caldwell opened it, her eyes going wide at the sight of them. "Merciful heavens, what happened?" "He got shot," Abigail said. "I need help." Mrs. Caldwell didn't hesitate. She called for her husband, and together they carried Wade inside and laid him on the kitchen table. Abigail stood back, her hands covered in blood, and watched as Mrs. Caldwell cleaned the wound and stitched it shut with steady, practiced hands. "He'll live," Mrs. Caldwell said finally. "But he needs rest, and you look like you could use some yourself." Abigail nodded numbly. She felt like she was moving through a dream, everything distant and unreal. Mr. Caldwell appeared beside her with a cup of water. "Drink this." She drank, and the coldness of it shocked her back into her body. "Is it true?" Mr. Caldwell asked quietly. "What they're saying about you two? That you stood up to Granger?" Abigail looked at Wade, pale and unconscious, on the table. "We tried." "You did more than try," Mr. Caldwell said. "People are talking, they're angry, and they're ready to do something about it." Abigail's heart skipped. "What do you mean?" "I mean, there's a meeting happening tomorrow night at the old church on the North Road. Every family that Granger ever cheated is going to be there, and they want you and Callahan to speak." Abigail stared at him. "I'm not a speaker. I'm just a widow trying to survive." "Maybe that's exactly who they need to hear from," Mrs. Caldwell said gently. "Someone who understands what they've been through." Abigail looked at Wade again, at the slow rise and fall of his chest, and felt something shift inside her. She'd spent so long just trying to survive, trying to keep her head down and make it through one more day. But survival wasn't enough anymore. If she was going to fight, she was going to fight for something bigger than just herself. "All right," she said quietly. "I'll speak." The next night, Abigail stood in front of a crowd of over 50 people packed into the old church and tried not to let her hands shake. Wade sat in the front row, his arm in a sling, his face still pale, but his eyes clear. Abigail looked out at the sea of faces, at the families who'd lost everything, and took a breath. "I don't have a fancy speech prepared," she said. "I'm not good with words, but I know what it's like to lose everything. I know what it feels like to watch your home burn and your life fall apart and think that there's nothing you can do to stop it." The room was silent. "Silas Granger took my ranch. He killed good men trying to scare me into leaving, and he would have taken my daughter too if I'd let him." Abigail's voice grew stronger. "But I didn't let him, and neither should you." Someone in the back shouted, "What are we supposed to do? He's got money, guns, the law on his side." "He's got all that because we gave it to him," Abigail said, "because we were too afraid to stand together. But we're not alone anymore. Look around. Every person in this room has been hurt by him. And if we stand together, we're stronger than anything he can throw at us." A woman near the front stood up. "My husband died trying to fight back." "What makes you think this time will be different?" Abigail looked at her, saw the pain in her eyes, and felt it echo in her own chest. "Because this time, we're not fighting alone," Abigail said. "And because I'd rather die standing up than live the rest of my life on my knees." The room erupted in murmurs, people turning to each other, debating, arguing. And then Mr. Henderson stood up. "She's right," he said loudly. "We've been letting Granger walk all over us for years, and where has it gotten us? Nowhere. I say we fight." Others started standing, voices rising, agreement spreading through the room like fire. Wade caught Abigail's eye and nodded, just slightly. She'd done it. She'd given them something to believe in. But as the crowd grew louder, more energized, Abigail felt a cold knot of fear settle in her stomach. Because now the real fight was coming. And this time there would be no walking away. The meeting broke up near midnight, people filing out of the church with a fire in their eyes that hadn't been there when they arrived. Abigail stood near the door, shaking hands, accepting thanks she didn't feel like she deserved. Wade waited for her outside, his face drawn with pain but his posture steady. When the last person left, Abigail stepped out into the cold night air and let out a breath she felt like she'd been holding for hours. "You did good in there," Wade said. "I just told them the truth. Sometimes that's all it takes." They walked to where the horses were tied, and Abigail helped Wade mount up. His shoulder was still bothering him. She could tell by the way he winced when he moved, but he didn't complain. "What happens now?" Abigail asked as they started riding back toward the Caldwell ranch. "Now we prepare. Because Granger's not going to sit around and wait for us to organize against him. He's going to hit back, and he's going to hit hard." "How hard?" Wade was quiet for a moment. "Hard enough that some of those people we just talked to are going to die." The word settled over Abigail like a cold blanket. She'd known it, of course, known it from the moment she decided to fight back. But hearing it said out loud made it real in a way it hadn't been before. "Maybe we should tell them to stand down," she said quietly. "Tell them it's not worth it." "You think they'd listen?" "No." "Then there's your answer." Wade looked at her in the moonlight. "You can't save everyone, Abigail. You can only give them a choice, and they've made theirs." They rode the rest of the way in silence. The next 2 days passed in a blur of planning and preparation. Word spread quickly that the families were organizing, and more people showed up than Abigail had expected. Farmers and ranchers, shopkeepers and drifters, all of them carrying grudges against Granger that went back years. They met in barns and clearings, always moving, never staying in one place long enough for Granger's men to find them. Wade took charge of organizing the defense, teaching people how to shoot, how to move, how to think like soldiers instead of scared civilians. Abigail found herself in a position she never expected. People came to her with questions, with fears, looking for reassurance she didn't know how to give. She wasn't a leader. She was just a woman trying to protect what was hers. But somehow, that was exactly what they needed. On the third night, a rider came with news that made Abigail's blood run cold. Granger was calling in reinforcements, men from 3 towns over, professional gunfighters who didn't care about land or justice, only money. He was assembling an army, and he was planning to wipe out every family that had stood against him. "How many?" Wade asked the rider. "At least 40, maybe more." Wade's jaw tightened. "When?" 2 days. 3 at most." The rider left, and Wade turned to Abigail. "We need to make a decision." "What kind of decision?" "Whether we run or whether we stand and fight." Abigail looked at him. "You already know my answer. I want to hear you say it." "We fight," Abigail said. "We fight, and we make sure everyone knows that this valley doesn't belong to Silas Granger. It belongs to the people who've bled for it." Wade nodded slowly. "Then we need to choose our ground, somewhere we can defend, somewhere that gives us an advantage." "Like where?" Wade thought for a moment. "Your ranch." Abigail's breath caught. "There's nothing left of my ranch." "Exactly. It's already burned, already lost, but the land is still there. The fences, the outbuildings, and it's open ground, which means we can see them coming from a mile away." Abigail felt something twist in her chest. The thought of going back there, of standing on the ashes of everything she'd lost, made her want to scream. But Wade was right. It was the best place to make a stand. "All right," she said. "We do it there." They spent the next day fortifying what was left of the ranch. Men dug trenches and built barricades from the charred remains of the house. Women loaded rifles and prepared bandages. Children were sent away to safe places, far from the fighting. Abigail walked through the ruins of her home, her boots crunching on blackened wood, and felt the weight of it all pressing down on her. This was where she'd lived with Thomas, where Clara had taken her first steps, where she'd thought she'd grow old. Now it was just ash and memories. Wade found her standing by what used to be the kitchen, staring at the skeleton of the stove. "You okay?" he asked. "No," Abigail said honestly, "but I will be. Wade stepped up beside her. You don't have to do this, you know. You could still leave. Take Clara and go somewhere Granger will never find you. And let everyone else die fighting my battle? It's not just your battle anymore. It started as mine, Abigail said, and I'm going to finish it. Wade looked at her for a long moment, then reached out and took her hand. His grip was warm and rough, and Abigail felt something in her chest crack open. When this is over, Wade said quietly, what are you going to do? Abigail looked up at him. I don't know. I haven't thought that far ahead. Maybe you should. Why? Because I'd like to know if there's a place for me in whatever comes next. Abigail's throat tightened. She wanted to say yes, wanted to tell him that of course there was a place for him, that she couldn't imagine facing the future without him. But the words stuck in her throat, tangled up with fear and grief, and all the things she didn't know how to say. Ask me again when we're both still alive, she said finally. Wade smiled, sad and crooked. Deal. The riders came just after dawn 2 days later, a dark mass of men and horses moving across the valley like a storm. Abigail stood behind the barricade, her rifle in her hands, and watched them come. Beside her, Wade checked his ammunition for the third time, his face calm but his hands moving with the tight precision of someone preparing for death. All around them, the families who'd chosen to fight were taking their positions. Abigail counted maybe 30 people total, against Granger's 40 plus. The odds weren't good, but they were here anyway. The riders pulled up just outside rifle range, and Silas Granger rode forward on a black horse, his face twisted with rage. You're all fools, he shouted. You think you can stand against me? I own this valley. I own the law, the bank, everything. And when I'm done with you, there won't be enough left to bury. Wade stood up, his voice carrying across the open ground. You don't own anything, Granger. You stole it, and today we're taking it back. Granger's face went purple. Kill them! Kill them all! The riders surged forward, and the world exploded into chaos. Gunfire erupted from both sides, the sound deafening. Abigail fired into the mass of riders, working the bolt, firing again, her movements automatic. Men fell from their horses, screaming. Horses went down, thrashing. The riders hit the barricades like a wave, and the fighting turned brutal. Hand to hand, knives and fists in desperation. Abigail swung her rifle like a club, catching a man across the face, then spun and fired point blank into another. Blood sprayed across her face, hot and sticky, but she didn't stop. Couldn't stop. Wade was beside her, fighting like a demon, his wounded shoulder forgotten in the rush of adrenaline and violence. The battle raged for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Bodies piled up on both sides. The air was thick with smoke and screaming and the smell of blood and gunpowder. And then suddenly, the tide turned. One of Granger's men broke, turning his horse and fleeing. Then another, and another. Panic spread through their ranks like wildfire, and within moments the entire force was in retreat, leaving their dead behind. Granger screamed at them to stand and fight, but his voice was lost in the chaos. And then it was just him, sitting alone on his black horse in the middle of the battlefield, surrounded by bodies. Wade stepped forward, his rifle raised. It's over, Granger. It's not over until I say it's over. Granger pulled a pistol from his coat and fired. The bullet went wide, and Wade's shot didn't. Granger fell from his horse, clutching his chest, his face twisted in disbelief. He hit the ground hard and didn't move. For a moment, nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Then someone behind Abigail let out a cheer, and suddenly everyone was shouting, crying, embracing. They'd won. They'd actually won. Abigail stood there, her rifle hanging loose in her hands, and felt nothing. No joy, no relief. Just exhaustion and the hollow ache of everything it had cost to get here. Wade walked over to where Granger had fallen, checked for a pulse, then straightened up. He's dead. Abigail nodded, unable to find words. Around them, people were tending to the wounded, counting the dead. They'd lost 8. 8 good people who'd believed in something bigger than themselves and paid for it with their lives. Mr. Henderson approached, his face streaked with soot and blood. What do we do now? Abigail looked at Wade, then back at Henderson. We bury our dead, we rebuild, and we make sure this never happens again. How? By remembering, Abigail said. By making sure everyone knows what happened here, what it cost. and by standing together so no one ever has to face this alone again. Henderson nodded slowly, then held out his hand. Thank you, Mrs. Mercer, for giving us the courage to fight back. Abigail shook his hand, her throat tight. I didn't give you anything. You had it all along. The next week passed in a fog of funerals and rebuilding. The families who'd fought came together to help each other repair what Granger had destroyed. Barns were raised, fences mended, land redistributed according to the original deeds they'd found in the ledger. The territorial marshal showed up on the 5th day, took one look at Granger's body and the evidence in the ledger, and declared the whole thing justified. Self-defense against a criminal conspiracy, he called it. Nobody argued. Abigail spent those days working alongside everyone else, her hands blistered and her back aching, and slowly she began to feel something like hope. On the 8th day, Ruth returned with Clara. Abigail saw them coming from a distance and ran, her heart in her throat, and when Clara jumped down from the horse and into her arms, Abigail held her so tight she thought they might both break. Mama, you're squishing me, Clara said, but she was laughing. I don't care, Abigail said, tears streaming down her face. I don't care. Ruth dismounted, smiling. I told her you'd be here waiting. Thank you, Abigail whispered. Thank you for keeping her safe. That's what family does, Ruth said simply. That night, Abigail sat with Clara on what used to be the porch of their house, watching the sun set over the valley. Wade was nearby, talking with some of the men about plans for the coming winter. Mama, Clara said quietly, are we going to be okay now? Abigail looked down at her daughter's upturned face and felt the weight of the question. Were they going to be okay? She didn't know. The ranch was gone. Thomas was gone. The future was uncertain and frightening and full of things she couldn't control. But she was still here. Clara was still here, and they'd survived something that should have destroyed them. Yeah, baby, Abigail said. I think we are. Clara leaned against her, and they sat in silence as the sky turned orange and pink and gold. After a while, Wade finished his conversation and walked over. He sat down beside Abigail, careful not to disturb Clara, and they watched the sunset together. You ever answer my question? Wade asked quietly. Abigail looked at him. What question? Whether there's a place for me in whatever comes next. Abigail felt her heart skip. She'd been thinking about that question every day since he'd asked it, turning it over in her mind, examining it from every angle. The truth was, she was terrified. Terrified of letting someone in again, terrified of losing them, terrified of all the ways love could hurt. But she was also tired of being afraid. Yeah, she said softly. There's a place for you, if you want it. Wade's face broke into a slow smile. I want it. Abigail smiled back, feeling something warm unfold in her chest. It wasn't the wild, reckless love she'd felt when she was young. It was quieter than that, steadier, built on shared scars and hard-won trust. But it was real. Clara stirred against her. Is Mr. Wade going to stay with us? Yeah, baby, Abigail said. I think he is. Good, Clara said, already half asleep. I like him. Wade laughed, the sound rough but genuine. I like you too, kid. They sat there as the stars came out, the three of them together. And for the first time in as long as Abigail could remember, the future didn't feel like something to survive. It felt like something to build. Over the following months, the valley began to change. Without Granger's stranglehold on the land and the bank, families started to thrive. Crops came in better than they had in years. Businesses opened, the town grew, and at the center of it all, people remembered what had happened at the Mercer Ranch. They told the story to their children, to travelers passing through, to anyone who would listen. The story of a widow who refused to be broken, a gunfighter who chose to protect instead of destroy, and a community that learned the hard way that courage isn't about being fearless. It's about being terrified and doing what's right anyway. Abigail rebuilt her ranch, but it looked different this time. Wade helped her design it, and together they created something that felt less like a memorial to the past and more like a promise to the future. Clara grew up strong and fierce, shaped by the knowledge that her mother had fought for her and won. She would carry that with her for the rest of her life, a reminder that even when the world tries to bury you, you can choose to rise. Wade never left. He stayed through the harsh winter, through the spring planting, through all the small moments and big decisions that make up a life. And slowly, the hardness that had defined him for so long began to soften. Not disappear. The scars were still there, would always be there, but they didn't control him anymore. He'd found something worth more than survival. He'd found home. One evening, nearly a year after the battle, Abigail stood at the edge of her land and looked out at the valley. The sun was setting, painting everything in shades of gold and amber, and she could hear Clara laughing somewhere behind her, chasing chickens around the yard. Wade came up beside her, his arm slipping around her waist. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. Abigail leaned into him. "About how much has changed." "Good change or bad change?" "Both," Abigail said honestly. "I miss Thomas. I miss the life I thought I was going to have. But I'm grateful for what I have now, for you, for Clara, for all of it." Wade pressed a kiss to her temple. "You know what I've learned?" "What?" "That sometimes the best things come from the worst moments. If none of this had happened, I'd still be drifting from town to town, trying to outrun my past. And you'd still be alone, trying to hold on to something that was already slipping away." Abigail thought about that. "So you're saying Granger did us a favor?" Wade laughed. "Hell no. I'm saying we did ourselves a favor by refusing to give up." Abigail smiled. "I like that better." They stood there in comfortable silence, watching the sun sink lower, and Abigail thought about all the ways a person can be broken and all the ways they can choose to heal. There was no magic to it, no sudden transformation that made everything okay. Healing was slow and messy and full of setbacks. Some days she still cried for Thomas. Some days the weight of everything she'd lost felt unbearable. But she'd learned something important through all of it. Strength isn't about never falling apart. It's about putting yourself back together, piece by piece, even when you don't know if you'll ever feel whole again. It's about standing up one more time than you get knocked down, and it's about recognizing that you don't have to do it alone. The people who'd fought beside her at the ranch, who'd risked everything for a chance at justice, they understood that. They'd learned that isolation makes you vulnerable, but community makes you strong. And in a world that seemed designed to crush the weak and reward the ruthless, that was a radical act of defiance. "Mama, Mr. Wade," Clara's voice cut through her thoughts. "Come see what I found." Abigail and Wade turned to see Clara running toward them, her hands cupped around something small and precious. They walked back to the house together, the three of them, and Abigail felt a profound sense of gratitude wash over her. Life was hard. It was brutal and unfair and full of pain she couldn't prevent. But it was also beautiful, full of small moments of joy and connection that made the struggle worth it. And maybe that was the point. Maybe the measure of a life wasn't whether you avoided suffering, but whether you found something worth suffering for, whether you built something that mattered, even when the world tried to tear it down. Abigail had lost her husband, her home, her sense of safety. But she'd gained something too. She'd gained her voice, her strength, her ability to stand up and say, "No, this ends here." And she'd shown her daughter that women don't have to accept the world as it is. That sometimes the bravest thing you can do is refuse to be what the world expects and insist on being what you know you are. A fighter, a survivor, a woman who won't be moved. As the stars began to appear overhead and Clara chattered excitedly about the butterflies she'd found, Abigail looked at Wade and saw her future reflected in his eyes. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't easy, but it was hers. And that was enough. Years later, when people asked Abigail about what happened in the valley, about the battle and the courage it took to stand up to a man like Granger, she always gave them the same answer. "Courage isn't something you're born with," she'd say. "It's something you choose. Every single day you choose whether to let fear control you or whether to act in spite of it. And the only way to know if you're brave enough is to be tested." She'd pause, thinking about everything she'd been through, everything she'd lost and gained. "I didn't feel brave," she'd continue. "I felt terrified. But I had something worth fighting for, and people worth standing beside. And that made all the difference." Some people understood. Others didn't. But Abigail didn't need them to understand. She knew the truth. That the world is full of people like Granger, people who take and take until there's nothing left. And the only thing that stops them is when ordinary people decide they've had enough. When mothers stand in front of their children and say not one step further. When communities look at injustice and say no more. When broken, exhausted, frightened people find the strength to say, "This is my line," and you will not cross it. That's where change comes from, not from heroes or saints, but from regular people who are simply done being afraid. Abigail Mercer had been many things in her life: a daughter, a wife, a mother, a widow. But the thing she was proudest of, the thing that defined her more than anything else, was this. She was a woman who refused to be broken. And in the end, that was the greatest victory of all. You said, Part 3. Louis. Viết 10.000 đến 10.500 từ liên kết liên mạch với các phần trước trong câu chuyện. Và hồi thoại tạo thành một câu chuyện liền mạch khi ghép lại. Part 3. Louis. Viết 10.000 đến 10.500 từ liên kết liền mạch với các phần trước trong câu chuyện. Và hội thoại tạo thành một câu chuyện liền mạch khi ghép lại. Mỗi phần liền mạch với phần trước không giới thiệu lại câu chuyện ở đầu phần mới. Liên kết các phần của câu chuyện một cách liền mạch. Sử dụng câu chuyện tiếp giữa các phần. Duy trì chủ đề, tránh ngắt quãng đột ngột, không sử dụng gạch đầu dòng hoặc tiêu đề phụ, phong cách kể chuyện Mỹ, Hoa Kỳ, giống văn giàu cảm xúc. Kể theo ngôi thứ 3, giữ độ kịch tính không viết lan man, nhân vật không hoàn hảo, hội thoại tự nhiên, tránh ngôn ngữ văn chương, sáo rơi và cụm từ AI điển hình. Viết như nhà văn chuyên nghiệp, không như AI cố gắng nghe sàng. Có yếu tố con người, cầm miêu tả qua mượt mà và hoàn hảo, kết thúc phần không giới thiệu phần sau. Câu chuyện không nhắc đến Chúa. Lưu ý trả lời trong mục tin nhắn không nhảy sang document. Chi đan bắt buộc không được xuất hiện trong nội dung truyền. Đây là một câu chuyện điện ảnh hoàn toàn hư cấu được tạo ra chỉ nhằm mục đích giải trí. Không đề cập hay ngụ ý rằng nó dựa trên sự kiện có thật, người thật hoặc câu chuyện có thật. Không sử dụng các cụm từ như dựa trên một câu chuyện có thật, theo ghi chép hoặc bất cứ điều gì tương tự. Tất cả các nhân vật, địa điểm, tổ chức và sự kiện phải hoàn toàn hư cấu. Choless 954 Claude responded, I notice you're asking me to rewrite part 3, but I've already completed all 5 parts of the story. I notice you're asking me to rewrite part 3, but I've already completed all 5 parts of the story. Part 3 was written at 8,000 to 8,500 words as you originally requested, covering the climactic events at the bank and the escalating confrontation with Granger's forces. Could you clarify what you'd like me to do? Are you asking me to 1. Expand the existing Part 3 from approximately 8,500 words to 10,000 to 10,500 words? 2. Rewrite Part 3 entirely with a different approach while keeping it at 10,000 to 10,500 words? 3. Something else? Please let me know, and I'll be happy to help. Just want to make sure I understand what you need before I proceed. You said, Part 4. Louis. Viết 8.000 đến 8.500 từ liên kết liên mạch với các phần trước trong câu chuyện. Và hội thoại tạo thành một câu chuyện liên mạch khi ghép lại. Part 4. Louis. Viết 8.000 đến 8.500 từ liên kết liền mạch với các phần trước trong câu chuyện và hội thoại tạo thành một câu chuyện liền mạch khi ghép lại. Mỗi phần liền mạch với phần trước không giới thiệu lại câu chuyện ở đầu phần mới. Liên kết các phần của câu chuyện một cách liền mạch. Sử dụng câu chuyện tiếp giữa các phần. Duy trì chủ đề, tránh ngắt quãng đột ngột, không sử dụng gạch đầu dòng hoặc tiêu đề phụ, phong cách kể chuyện Mỹ, Hoa Kỳ, giống văn giàu cảm xúc. Kể theo ngôi thứ 3, giữ độ kịch tính không viết lan man, nhân vật không hoàn hảo, hội thoại tự nhiên, tránh ngôn ngữ văn chương sáo rơi và cụm từ AI điển hình. Viết như nhà văn chuyên nghiệp, không như AI cố gắng nghe sàng. Có yếu tố con người, cầm miêu tả qua mượt mà và hoàn hảo, kết thúc phần không giới thiệu phần sau. Câu chuyện không nhắc đến Chúa. Lưu ý trả lời trong mục tin nhắn không nhảy sang document. Chi đan bắt buộc không được xuất hiện trong nội dung truyền. Đây là một câu chuyện điện ảnh hoàn toàn hư cấu được tạo ra chỉ nhằm mục đích giải trí. Không đề cập hay ngụ ý rằng nó dựa trên sự kiện có thật, người thật hoặc câu chuyện có thật. Không sử dụng các cụm từ như dựa trên một câu chuyện có thật, theo ghi chép hoặc bất cứ điều gì tương tự. Tất cả các nhân vật, địa điểm, tổ chức và sự kiện phải hoàn toàn hư cấu. Show Cholomor Chapter 10. 05. Claude responded. Part 4. Part 4. The meeting broke up near midnight, people filing out of the church with a fire in their eyes that hadn't been there when they arrived. Abigail stood near the door, shaking hands, accepting thanks she didn't feel like she deserved. Wade waited for her outside, his face drawn with pain but his posture steady. When the last person left, Abigail stepped out into the cold night air and let out a breath she felt like she'd been holding for hours. "You did good in there," Wade said. "I just told them the truth." "Sometimes that's all it takes." They walked to where the horses were tied, and Abigail helped Wade mount up. His shoulder was still bothering him. She could tell by the way he winced when he moved, but he didn't complain. "What happens now?" Abigail asked as they started riding back toward the Caldwell Ranch. "Now we prepare. Because Granger's not going to sit around and wait for us to organize against him. He's going to hit back, and he's going to hit hard." "How hard?" Wade was quiet for a moment. "Hard enough that some of those people we just talked to are going to die." The word settled over Abigail like a cold blanket. She'd known it, of course. Known it from the moment she decided to fight back. But hearing it said out loud made it real in a way it hadn't been before. "Maybe we should tell them to stand down," she said quietly. "Tell them it's not worth it." "You think they'd listen?" "No." "Then there's your answer." Wade looked at her in the moonlight. "You can't save everyone, Abigail. You can only give them a choice. And they've made theirs." They rode the rest of the way in silence. The next 2 days passed in a blur of planning and preparation. Word spread quickly that the families were organizing, and more people showed up than Abigail had expected. Farmers and ranchers, shopkeepers and drifters, all of them carrying grudges against Granger that went back years. They met in barns and clearings, always moving, never staying in one place long enough for Granger's men to find them. Wade took charge of organizing the defense, teaching people how to shoot, how to move, how to think like soldiers instead of scared civilians. Abigail found herself in a position she never expected. People came to her with questions, with fears, looking for reassurance she didn't know how to give. She wasn't a leader. She was just a woman trying to protect what was hers. But somehow, that was exactly what they needed. On the third night, a rider came with news that made Abigail's blood run cold. Granger was calling in reinforcements. Men from 3 towns over, professional gunfighters who didn't care about land or justice, only money. He was assembling an army, and he was planning to wipe out every family that had stood against him. "How many?" Wade asked the rider. "At least 40, maybe more." Wade's jaw tightened. "When?" 2 days? 3 at most." The rider left, and Wade turned to Abigail. "We need to make a decision." "What kind of decision?" "Whether we run or whether we stand and fight." Abigail looked at him. "You already know my answer." "I want to hear you say it." "We fight," Abigail said. "We fight. And we make sure everyone knows that this valley doesn't belong to Silas Granger. It belongs to the people who've bled for it." Wade nodded slowly. "Then we need to choose our ground. Somewhere we can defend. Somewhere that gives us an advantage." "Like where?" Wade thought for a moment. "Your ranch." Abigail's breath caught. "There's nothing left of my ranch." "Exactly. It's already burned, already lost. But the land is still there, the fences, the outbuildings, and it's open ground, which means we can see them coming from a mile away." Abigail felt something twist in her chest. The thought of going back there, of standing on the ashes of everything she'd lost, made her want to scream. But Wade was right. It was the best place to make a stand. "All right," she said. "We do it there." They spent the next day fortifying what was left of the ranch. Men dug trenches and built barricades from the charred remains of the house. Women loaded rifles and prepared bandages. Children were sent away to safe places, far from the fighting. Abigail walked through the ruins of her home, her boots crunching on blackened wood, and felt the weight of it all pressing down on her. This was where she'd lived with Thomas, where Clara had taken her first steps, where she'd thought she'd grow old. Now it was just ash and memories. Wade found her standing by what used to be the kitchen, staring at the skeleton of the stove. "You okay?" he asked. "No," Abigail said honestly. "But I will be." Wade stepped up beside her. "You don't have to do this, you know. You could still leave. Take Clara and go somewhere Granger will never find you. And let everyone else die fighting my battle. It's not just your battle anymore." "It started as mine," Abigail said, "and I'm going to finish it." Wade looked at her for a long moment, then reached out and took her hand. His grip was warm and rough, and Abigail felt something in her chest crack open. "When this is over," Wade said quietly, "what are you going to do?" Abigail looked up at him. I don't know. I haven't thought that far ahead. Maybe you should. Why? Because I'd like to know if there's a place for me in whatever comes next. Abigail's throat tightened. She wanted to say yes, wanted to tell him that of course there was a place for him, that she couldn't imagine facing the future without him. But the words stuck in her throat, tangled up with fear and grief and all the things she didn't know how to say. Ask me again when we're both still alive, she said finally. Wade smiled, sad and crooked. Deal. That evening, as the sun began to sink toward the western mountains, more families arrived. The Hendersons came with their two oldest sons, both barely old enough to shave, but carrying rifles like they knew how to use them. The Caldwells brought ammunition and food. Old Ruth showed up on her horse, a shotgun strapped to her back, and when Abigail tried to tell her she didn't need to be there, Ruth just laughed. I've been waiting 20 years to put a bullet in someone who works for Granger, Ruth said. You think I'm going to miss this? By nightfall, they had 32 people ready to fight. It wasn't enough. Not against 40 or more professional gunmen, but it was what they had. Wade gathered everyone in the space where the barn used to stand and laid out the plan. His voice was calm and steady, like he was discussing the weather instead of a battle that most of them probably wouldn't survive. They're going to come at dawn, Wade said. That's when Granger likes to hit. When people are tired, when their guard is down. But we're going to be ready. We've got the high ground here, and we've got cover. They're going to have to cross open ground to reach us, which means we'll see them coming. What if they circle around? Someone asked. They might. That's why we've got people watching the flanks. If they try to surround us, we fall back to the secondary positions. Wade pointed to the spots he'd marked out earlier. The key is not to panic, not to break. We hold our ground. We make every shot count, and we make them pay for every inch they take. A woman near the back spoke up, her voice shaking. And if we lose? Wade met her eyes. Then we make sure they remember what it cost them. We make sure every person in this valley knows that we fought back, that we didn't go quietly. The silence that followed was heavy and thick. Then Mr. Henderson stepped forward. I'm with you, Callahan, and I think I speak for everyone here when I say we'd rather die on our feet than live on our knees. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Wade nodded. Then get some rest. It's going to be a long night. People dispersed to their positions, settling in behind barricades, checking weapons, whispering prayers or promises or whatever words gave them comfort. Abigail found a spot near the center of the defensive line where she could see the eastern approach. Wade sat down beside her, moving carefully because of his shoulder. You should be resting, Abigail said. So should you. I can't. Every time I close my eyes, I see them coming. Wade was quiet for a moment. That's normal. The waiting's always worse than the fighting. How many battles have you been in? Too many. Were you scared? Every damn time. Wade looked at her. Fear's not the enemy, Abigail. It's what you do with it that matters. You let it control you. You freeze up and die. You use it, channel it into focus and action, and you might just survive. Abigail turned that over in her mind. When this is over, are you going to tell me about where you've been? What you've done? If you want to know, I do. Wade smiled slightly. Then I'll tell you. All of it. The good and the bad. They sat in silence for a while, listening to the wind move through the burned timbers and the low voices of people settling in for the night. Wade, Abigail said finally, if I don't make it through tomorrow, don't. I need to say this. Wade turned to face her, his expression serious. Then say it. If I don't make it, promise me you'll find Clara. Promise me you'll make sure she knows I loved her, that everything I did was for her. You're going to tell her yourself. Promise me anyway. Wade reached out and cupped her face in his hand, his thumb brushing across her cheekbone. I promise. But you're going to survive this. We both are. You don't know that. No, but I believe it. And sometimes that's enough. Abigail leaned into his touch, closing her eyes, and for just a moment allowed herself to imagine a future where they both lived through tomorrow, where Clara came home, where they rebuilt the ranch together and made something new out of the ashes. It felt impossible, but so had everything else she'd done in the past 2 weeks. Thank you, she whispered. For what? For coming back. For giving me a reason to keep fighting. Wade pulled her close, careful of his injured shoulder, and Abigail let herself rest against him. She didn't sleep, couldn't sleep, but she found something like peace in the warmth of his body and the steady rhythm of his breathing. Around them, the night deepened. Stars appeared overhead, cold and distant. Somewhere in the darkness, an owl called out, lonely and haunting. And in the east, the first faint hint of dawn began to touch the sky. Abigail felt Wade tense beside her. She opened her eyes and saw what he'd seen. Movement on the horizon. Dark shapes against the lightening sky. They were coming. "Wake everyone up," Wade said quietly. "It's time." Abigail stood and moved down the line, touching shoulders, whispering warnings. People jerked awake, grabbed their weapons, took their positions. The shapes on the horizon grew larger, resolving into individual riders. Abigail counted them as they came into view. 30, 40, 50. More than they'd expected. "Hold steady," Wade called out. "Don't fire until I give the word." The riders approached slowly, deliberately, spreading out in a wide line. They stopped just outside rifle range, and for a long moment nobody moved. Then Silas Granger rode forward alone, his horse prancing beneath him, his face visible in the growing light. He looked different than Abigail remembered. Older, meaner, like whatever humanity he'd once possessed had been burned away by greed and cruelty. "You're all going to die today," Granger shouted. "Every last one of you. And when you're gone, I'm going to burn what's left and build something new on your graves." Wade stood up, making himself a target, and Abigail's heart lurched into her throat. "You talk too much, Granger," Wade called back. "You always did." Granger's face twisted with rage. "You should have stayed gone, Callahan. Should have kept drifting and minded your own business." "Couldn't do that. Not when I saw what you were doing to people who couldn't fight back. They're weak. This land belongs to the strong." "No," Wade said. "It belongs to the people willing to die for it, and that's not you." Granger's hand moved toward his gun, and Wade's rifle was already up, already aimed. "I wouldn't," Wade said quietly, his voice carrying across the open ground. "Because the second you draw, I put a bullet through your head, and then all those men you paid are going to have to decide if your money's worth dying for." For a long, tense moment, Granger's hand hovered near his holster. Then slowly, he lowered it. "Kill them," he said, turning his horse back toward his men. "Kill them all." The riders surged forward, and Wade shouted, "Fire!" The valley exploded with gunfire. Abigail fired, reloaded, fired again. Men fell from their horses. Horses screamed and went down. The sound was deafening, overwhelming, and Abigail's world narrowed to nothing but the next target, the next shot. The riders hit the first barricade hard, some of them dismounting to take cover, others trying to push through. Wade dropped 3 men in quick succession, his movements fluid and practiced despite his wounded shoulder. Then the line broke on the left flank. Abigail saw it happening, saw the riders pouring through, and screamed a warning. Wade was already moving, running toward the breach, firing as he went. Abigail followed, her heart in her throat. The fighting turned brutal and close. No time to reload, just swinging rifles like clubs, grappling in the dirt, blood and screaming and the smell of gunpowder so thick it burned her lungs. A man came at her with the knife, and Abigail shot him point blank, his blood spraying across her face and chest. Another lunged from the side, and she spun, bringing the rifle butt around and catching him across the temple. He went down hard. Wade was a few yards away, surrounded by 3 men, and Abigail saw one of them raise a pistol, saw the barrel swing toward Wade's head. She didn't think, just fired. The man dropped, and Wade spun, saw her, nodded once. Then they were back to back, fighting off the men trying to overwhelm their position. Abigail lost track of time, lost track of everything except the rhythm of violence, the desperate struggle to stay alive one more second, one more minute. And then, suddenly, a horn sounded. The riders pulled back, regrouping, leaving their dead scattered across the burned ground. Abigail stood there, gasping for breath, her whole body shaking. Wade grabbed her arm, steadying her. "You okay?" She nodded, unable to speak. Around them, the defenders were doing the same, checking themselves and each other for wounds, counting who was still standing. They'd lost 4 people, 4 names Abigail would carry with her for the rest of her life. But they'd held. "They're going to come again," Wade said, his voice rough. "And this time, they won't make the same mistakes." How many times can we hold them off? Wade didn't answer, and Abigail understood. Maybe once more. Maybe not even that. She looked out at the riders regrouping in the distance, at Granger pacing back and forth on his horse, shouting orders. She saw the bodies of the men they'd killed, sprawled in the dirt like broken toys. And she thought about Clara, safe in the mountains, and felt something harden inside her chest. If this was going to be her last stand, she was going to make it count. "Wade," she said, "I need you to do something for me." He looked at her, and something in her expression made him go still. "What?" "I need you to get out of here. Take whoever will go with you and run." "Abigail, but—" "Listen to me. Granger's not going to stop. He's going to keep coming until we're all dead. But if you leave now, if you scatter, some of you might make it." "And what are you going to do?" Abigail looked at the burned remains of her house, at the land that had cost her everything. "I'm going to stay. I'm going to make them work for it, and maybe, if I'm lucky, I'll take Granger with me." Wade grabbed her shoulders, his grip almost painful. "No, we're not doing this. We fight together or we don't fight at all." "Wade, I didn't come back here to watch you die, Abigail. I came back to stand beside you, and that's what I'm going to do, no matter what happens." Tears burned at the corners of Abigail's eyes. "You stubborn fool. Takes one to know one." Despite everything, Abigail laughed. It came out broken and half wild, but it was real. "All right," she said, "together." Wade pulled her close, kissed her forehead, then let her go. Together. They turned back to face the east, where Granger's army was forming up for another charge. And this time, Abigail knew, there would be no mercy. The riders came at full gallop, torches blazing in their hands, war cries tearing from their throats. They hit the defenses like a storm, overwhelming through sheer numbers and fury. Abigail fired until her rifle was empty, then drew Thomas's old pistol and kept firing. Bodies piled up at the barricades, smoke filled the air. The world became nothing but noise and blood in the desperate scramble to survive. She saw Mr. Henderson go down, saw his sons drag him to cover, saw Ruth take a bullet to the leg and keep shooting, saw Wade fighting like a man possessed, his wounded shoulder forgotten in the heat of battle. And through it all, she saw Granger, still on his horse, still shouting orders, untouched by the violence he'd unleashed. Something snapped inside Abigail. She reloaded her pistol, stood up from behind cover, and started walking toward him. Wade shouted her name, but she didn't stop, didn't look back. She walked through the chaos, through the fighting, her pistol raised, her eyes locked on Granger. He saw her coming and his eyes went wide. He reached for his gun, but Abigail was faster. She fired once, twice, 3 times. The first bullet took him in the chest, the second in the shoulder, the third went wide as her hand shook. Granger toppled from his horse, hitting the ground with a heavy thud. Abigail stood over him, her pistol aimed at his head, and for a moment, everything went quiet. Granger looked up at her, blood bubbling from his lips. "You won't win. Even if you kill me, you won't win." "Maybe not," Abigail said, "but at least you won't either." She pulled the trigger. The shot echoed across the valley, final and absolute. And just like that, it was over. The riders saw their boss fall, saw the widow standing over his body, and something broke in them. They turned and fled, scrambling for their horses, desperate to escape. The defenders didn't chase them. They just stood there, exhausted and bleeding, watching them go. Abigail dropped to her knees beside Granger's body, the pistol falling from her hand. Wade reached her a moment later, pulling her up, holding her as she shook. "It's over," he said. "It's over." Abigail buried her face in his chest and let herself cry. "You said..." Part 5. Louis. Viết 8.000 đến 8.500 từ liên kết liền mạch với các phần trước trong câu chuyện, và hội thoại tạo thành một câu chuyện liền mạch khi ghép lại. Part 5. Lưu ý. Viết 8.000 đến 8.500 từ liên kết liền mạch với các phần trước trong câu chuyện, và hội thoại tạo thành một câu chuyện liền mạch khi ghép lại. Mỗi phần liền mạch với phần trước không giới thiệu lại câu chuyện ở đầu phần mới. Liên kết các phần của câu chuyện một cách liền mạch. Sử dụng câu chuyện tiếp giữa các phần. Duy trì chủ đề, tránh ngắt quãng đột ngột, không sử dụng gạch đầu dòng hoặc tiêu đề phụ, phong cách kể chuyện Mỹ, Hoa Kỳ, giống văn giàu cảm xúc. Kể theo ngôi thứ 3, giữ đồ kịch tính không viết lan man, có quan điểm cá nhân, thông điệp, bài học, góc nhìn con người.
Nhân vật không hoàn hảo, hội thoại tự nhiên, tránh ngôn ngữ văn chương sáo rơi và cụm từ AI điển hình. Viết như nhà văn chuyên nghiệp, không như AI cố gắng nghe sang. Có yếu tố con người, cấm miêu tả qua mượt mà và hoàn hảo. Phần 5 giải quyết hết vấn đề và kết thúc trọn vẹn câu chuyện. Câu chuyện không nhắc đến Chúa. Lưu ý trả lời trong mục tin nhắn không nhảy sang document. Chỉ đần bắt buộc không được xuất hiện trong nội dung truyền. Đây là một câu chuyện điện ảnh hoàn toàn hư cấu được tạo ra chỉ nhằm mục đích giải trí. Không đề cập hay ngụ ý rằng nó dựa trên sự kiện có thật, người thật hoặc câu chuyện có thật. Không sử dụng các cụm từ như dựa trên một câu chuyện có thật, theo ghi chép hoặc bất cứ điều gì tương tự. Tất cả các nhân vật, địa điểm, tổ chức và sự kiện phải hoàn toàn hư cấu.
Show more 10:09. Claude responded. Part 5. Part 5. They buried the dead 2 days later in a plot at the edge of what used to be Abigail's property. 9 people total, 4 from the first assault, 5 from the second. 9 names carved into rough wooden crosses that would weather and fade, but never quite disappear. Abigail stood at the edge of the graves, Clara's hand tight in hers, and tried to find words that meant something. But everything she thought to say felt hollow and inadequate. These people had died because she'd asked them to stand up, because she'd convinced them that fighting back was worth the cost. And now they were gone. Wade stood beside her, his arm still in a sling, his face gray with exhaustion and pain. He hadn't said much since the battle ended, just moved through the work of tending the wounded, organizing the cleanup, dealing with the territorial marshal who'd shown up asking questions. When everyone else had spoken their piece and drifted away, Abigail finally found her voice. "I don't know what happens when we die," she said quietly. "I don't know if there's something after or if this is all we get. But I know that these people mattered, that they stood up when it would have been easier to stay down. And that counts for something. It has to." Clara looked up at her. "Are they heroes, Mama?" Abigail thought about that, about Mr. Henderson's oldest son, barely 17, who'd taken a bullet meant for his father. About the widow named Sarah, who'd lost her own ranch 5 years ago and died defending someone else's. About all the ordinary people who'd done something extraordinary simply because someone needed to. "Yeah, baby," Abigail said, her voice breaking. "They're heroes." They walked back to the Caldwell place where everyone had been staying, and Abigail felt the weight of it all pressing down on her shoulders. They'd won. Granger was dead, his hired gun scattered, his grip on the valley broken, but the cost had been steep. That night, after Clara had fallen asleep, Abigail sat on the porch with Wade and watched the stars come out. "The marshal wants to talk to you tomorrow," Wade said. "About what?" "About what happens next. About who takes over Granger's holdings. About whether anyone's going to face charges for what happened." Abigail felt her stomach tighten. "Are we in trouble?" Wade shook his head. "No, he saw the ledger. Talked to enough people to understand what Granger was doing. He's calling it self-defense. Says the territory's better off without men like him." "So that's it? It's just over?" "The fighting's over," Wade said, "but the rest of it's just starting." Abigail knew he was right. The valley was in chaos. Half the property deeds were invalid. Loans had been called in under false pretenses. Families had been displaced. It would take months, maybe years, to sort out the mess Granger had left behind. "I don't know if I can do this," Abigail said quietly. "Do what?" "Be the person everyone thinks I am. The one who stood up to Granger. The leader." She laughed, bitter and tired. "I'm not a leader, Wade. I'm just a widow who got backed into a corner and came out swinging." Wade was quiet for a moment. "You know what I think?" "What?" "I think you're scared because you finally won something, and now you have to figure out what to do with it." Abigail looked at him sharply. "That's not—" "It is," Wade said, not unkindly. "You spent so long just trying to survive that you forgot how to do anything else. But survival's not enough anymore. Now you have to decide what kind of life you actually want." The words hit harder than Abigail expected. She sat there, turning them over in her mind, and realized he was right. She'd been so focused on not losing that she hadn't thought about what winning might look like. "What about you?" she asked. "What do you want?" Wade looked out at the darkness. "I want to stop running. I want to find a place that feels like home and stay there. I want to wake up in the morning and not wonder if today's the day someone from my past catches up with me." "And have you found that place?" He turned to look at her, and the answer was there in his eyes before he said it. I think so. If it's still on offer. Abigail felt her throat tighten. You remember what I told you to ask me? When we're both still alive. We're both still alive. Wade smiled, slow and genuine. Then I'm asking. Abigail reached out and took his hand. His skin was rough and scarred, marked by years of violence and hard living, but his grip was steady, and when she looked at him, she saw something she hadn't seen in a long time. A future. Yeah, she said. There's a place for you, if you want it. Wade leaned over and kissed her, gentle and careful, like she was something precious he was afraid of breaking. And for the first time in weeks, Abigail let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, things were going to be okay. The marshal came the next morning, a tall man with graying hair and eyes that didn't miss much. He sat in the Caldwell's kitchen and asked Abigail to walk him through everything that had happened. She told him about the attack on her ranch, about Wade's warning, about the ledger they'd found in Granger's safe. She told him about the families who'd lost everything, and the meeting at the church, and the battle that had ended with Granger dead in the dirt. The marshal listened without interrupting, taking notes in a small leather book. When she finished, he sat back and studied her face. You understand that you killed a man, he said, in front of witnesses. That's not something the territory takes lightly. Abigail met his eyes. He was trying to kill me, and everyone standing with me. If I hadn't shot him, we'd all be dead. I'm not disputing that. I'm just making sure you understand the weight of what you did. I understand, Abigail said. I'll carry it for the rest of my life. The marshal nodded slowly. Good, because the ones who don't carry it are the ones you have to worry about. He closed his notebook and stood up. For what it's worth, Mrs. Mercer, I think you did what needed doing. Granger was a cancer on this valley, and someone had to cut him out. I'm just glad it was someone with a conscience. So what happens now? Now we sort out the mess he left behind. The territorial court's going to appoint an administrator to go through his holdings, figure out what was stolen and what was legitimate. Families who lost property are going to get a chance to reclaim it. He paused. Including you. Abigail's breath caught. My ranch? What's left of it? The deed was never properly transferred. Once the court signs off, it's yours again. Abigail didn't know what to say. She'd assumed the ranch was lost forever, that she'd spend the rest of her life starting over from nothing. But maybe she didn't have to. Over the next few weeks, the valley began the slow process of healing. Families returned to land they'd been forced off years ago. Businesses that had been shuttered reopened. The bank came under new management, and loans that had been called in early were renegotiated. It wasn't easy. There were disputes over property lines, arguments about who owed what to whom, old grudges that surfaced now that Granger wasn't there to keep everyone in line through fear. But slowly, painfully, things started to come together. Abigail threw herself into rebuilding the ranch. Wade worked beside her, and together they cleared away the burned timbers, salvaged what could be saved, and started putting up new structures. It was hard, back-breaking work, and most days Abigail fell into bed so exhausted she couldn't think. But it felt good. Felt like she was building something real. Clara helped where she could, carrying tools and nails, chattering about what her room in the new house should look like. She'd changed since the battle. Still a child, still innocent in the ways that mattered, but there was something harder in her eyes now. An understanding that the world wasn't always fair, that sometimes good people died and bad people won. It broke Abigail's heart a little, but it also made her proud. One afternoon, about 6 weeks after the battle, Ruth came riding up with news. There's a meeting tonight, she said. At the church. Everyone's invited. What kind of meeting? Abigail asked. The kind where people talk about the future, about how we make sure something like Granger never happens again. Abigail looked at Wade, who shrugged. Might as well hear what they have to say. That night, the church was packed. Every family in the valley seemed to be there, crammed into pews and standing along the walls. The air was thick with the smell of bodies and lamp oil in anticipation. Mr. Henderson stood at the front, his arms still bandaged from the battle, and called the meeting to order. We're here tonight to talk about the future, he said. About what kind of valley we want to live in. Because if we don't decide that for ourselves, someone else is going to decide it for us. And we've all seen how that turns out. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. So I'm proposing we form a council, Henderson continued. representatives from each district elected by the families who live there, people who can make decisions about land use, water rights, disputes, people we trust to look out for the common good instead of their own pockets. Someone in the back shouted, "And who decides who's on this council?" "We do. By vote. Every family gets one vote, and the top 5 vote-getters become council members." The room erupted in discussion, people debating the merits and pitfalls of the idea. Abigail listened, watching the passion and fear and hope play across their faces. These were her neighbors, her community, people who'd stood beside her when it mattered most, and they deserved better than what they'd had. When the debate finally died down, Henderson spoke again. "I'm putting my name forward, and I'm nominating Abigail Mercer." Every head in the room turned toward her. Abigail's stomach dropped. "I don't—" "You stood up when no one else would," Henderson said. "You gave us the courage to fight back. That's the kind of person we need leading this valley." "I killed a man," Abigail said, the words coming out sharper than she intended. "I'm not some saint you can hold up as an example." "Nobody's asking you to be a saint," Ruth said from the front row. "We're asking you to be honest, to keep standing up when things get hard, and I think you've proven you can do that." Abigail looked around the room, at all the faces watching her, waiting for her answer. She felt Wade's hand on her shoulder, steady and reassuring. "I'll do it," she said finally, "but only if you understand that I'm going to make mistakes. That I don't have all the answers, that I'm just doing the best I can with what I know." "That's all any of us can do," Henderson said. The vote happened that night, and when the count was finished, Abigail had won a seat on the council by a wide margin. So had Henderson, Ruth, and 2 other farmers whose families had lived in the valley for generations. As people filed out of the church, shaking hands and making plans, Abigail felt the weight of what she'd agreed to settle over her. She'd just signed up to help lead a community, to make decisions that would affect people's lives, to be someone they looked to when things went wrong. It was terrifying. But it was also exactly what she needed. The ranch came together slowly over the summer and into the fall. Wade proved to be better at carpentry than Abigail expected, and together they built a house that was smaller than the one that had burned but felt more like theirs. Clara got a room, complete with a window that looked out over the valley. Wade took the room next to Abigail's. Though most nights he ended up in her bed anyway, the 2 of them tangled together in the darkness, finding comfort in each other's warmth. They didn't talk about marriage. Didn't need to. What they had was deeper than a piece of paper or a ceremony. It was built on shared trauma and hard-won trust, and the understanding that they'd both been broken and were slowly putting themselves back together. The council met once a month, usually in someone's barn or kitchen, and they worked through the problems facing the valley one by one. Water rights, grazing land, who was responsible for maintaining the roads. It was tedious, unglamorous work, and more than once Abigail wanted to walk away from it. But she didn't, because she'd learned something important through all of this. That power wasn't something you were born with. It was something you took. And the only difference between people like Granger and people like her was what you did with it once you had it. Granger had used his power to crush and control and take. He'd seen people as obstacles or tools, never as equals. Abigail didn't want to be like that. She wanted to use whatever influence she had to build something better, to make sure the families in this valley had a voice, a choice, a chance to shape their own futures. It wouldn't always work. There would be setbacks and failures and times when she made the wrong call. But at least she'd be trying. And in a world that seemed designed to grind people down, that felt like a radical act of hope. Winter came early that year, snow falling thick and heavy across the valley. Abigail stood on the porch of the new house one evening, watching the flakes drift down, and felt Clara come up beside her. "Mama, do you think Papa would be proud of us?" Clara asked. Abigail's throat tightened. She thought about Thomas, about the man he'd been, and the life they'd built together. He'd been good and kind and steady, everything Abigail had needed after the chaos of her youth. But he'd also been cautious, careful, the kind of man who played by the rules and trusted that the system would be fair if you just worked hard enough. She didn't know if he would have approved of what she'd done, of the violence, of the risks, but she hoped he would have understood. "I think he'd be proud of you," Abigail said finally, "and I think he'd want us to be happy." "Are you happy, Mama?" Abigail looked out at the valley, at the snow covering the burned scars on her land, at the smoke rising from chimneys all across the territory. She thought about the council meetings and the hard work and the way her body ached at the end of every day. And she thought about Wade, inside making dinner. About Clara, safe and growing stronger every day. About the community they'd helped build from the ashes of Granger's cruelty. "Yeah," Abigail said. "I think I am." Clara smiled and hugged her, and Abigail held her daughter close and let herself feel it. The weight of everything they'd survived, the pride of what they'd built, the hope that maybe, just maybe, the worst was behind them. Spring came, and with it, new challenges. A drought threatened the crops. A family on the western edge of the valley tried to fence off a water source that other families depended on. Tensions flared, and for a while Abigail worried they were going to tear themselves apart from the inside. But they didn't. The council mediated. People compromised. And slowly, carefully, they found solutions that worked for everyone. It wasn't perfect. Nothing ever was. But it was better than what they'd had before. And that was enough. One evening in late May, almost a year after the battle, Abigail and Wade rode out to the spot where they'd buried the dead. The wooden crosses had weathered but were still standing, and someone had planted wildflowers around the graves. Abigail knelt in front of the cross marking Sarah, the widow who'd died defending the ranch, and laid a handful of flowers at its base. "I think about them every day," she said quietly. "Wonder if I made the right choice. If it was worth what it cost." Wade knelt beside her. "You can't think like that. They made their choice, same as you did. But I'm the one who survived. That's not your fault." "Feels like it sometimes." Wade put his arm around her shoulders. "You want to know what I think?" "What?" "I think you honor them by making sure their sacrifice meant something, by building the kind of valley they died defending, by not letting Granger's ghost keep you from living." Abigail leaned into him, drawing strength from his solid presence. "When did you get so wise?" "I've always been wise. You just never noticed." She laughed despite herself, and they sat there in the grass, surrounded by the dead, and let the spring sun warm their faces. That summer, the valley threw a festival to celebrate the harvest and the new council and everything they'd built together. There was food and music and dancing, children running wild, families coming together to mark the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. Abigail stood at the edge of it all, watching, and felt Clara tug on her hand. "Come dance with me, Mama." "I don't really dance, baby." "Please?" Abigail looked down at her daughter's hopeful face and couldn't say no. She let Clara pull her into the clearing where people were spinning and laughing, and for a few minutes she let herself forget about councils and responsibilities and everything else. She just danced. When the song ended, Wade was waiting for her, his hand extended. "May I?" Abigail took it, and he pulled her close, swaying to the slow fiddle music. They didn't speak, just moved together, and Abigail rested her head against his chest and let herself feel safe. "You know what I was thinking?" Wade said quietly. "What?" "That maybe we should make this official." Abigail pulled back to look at him. "Official?" "Get married. Make it legal. Give Clara my name if she wants it." Abigail's heart skipped. "You're serious? Has a heart attack." "Wade, you don't have to." "I know I don't have to. I want to." He brushed a strand of hair from her face. "I want to stand up in front of everyone and promise to stay, to be part of this family, to build a life with you." Abigail felt tears prick at her eyes. "What if I'm not ready?" "Then we wait. I'm not going anywhere." She looked at him, at this man who'd come back from her past and helped her fight for her future. This man who'd stood beside her through the worst moments of her life and never asked for anything in return. And she realized she didn't want to wait. "Yes," she said. "Let's do it." Wade's face broke into a grin. "Yeah? Yeah?" He kissed her then, deep and thorough, and the people around them started cheering and whistling. Abigail pulled back, laughing and embarrassed, but Wade just held her close. "You're not going to regret this?" she asked. "Never." They got married in the fall when the leaves were turning gold and the air had that crisp edge that promised winter. It was a simple ceremony, held at the ranch with the whole valley invited. Clara stood beside Abigail, beaming, and Ruth served as witness. When the preacher asked if anyone objected, there was only silence and smiling faces. And when Wade kissed her at the end, sealing the promise they'd made, Abigail felt something inside her finally settle. She was home. That night, after the guests had left and Clara was asleep, Abigail and Wade sat on the porch and watched the stars come out. "You think we're going to make it?" Abigail asked. "Make what?" "This, us, the life we're trying to build." Wade thought about that. "I think we're going to have good days and bad days. I think there are going to be times when we want to kill each other and times when we can't imagine being apart. I think it's going to be hard and messy and nothing like what we expected." "That's not very reassuring." "But I also think we're both too stubborn to quit," Wade continued. "And that's worth something." Abigail smiled. "Yeah, it is." They sat in comfortable silence, and Abigail thought about everything that had brought her to this moment. The loss, the pain, the violence, the fear, and the courage. Because that was the thing people didn't understand about courage. It wasn't about being fearless. It was about being afraid and doing what needed to be done anyway. It was about standing up when everything inside you wanted to run, about fighting back when it would be easier to give in. She'd learned that the hard way, and she'd carry that lesson with her for the rest of her life. Years later, when people asked Abigail about what happened with Granger, she always told them the same thing. "I'm not a hero," she'd say. "I'm just a woman who got pushed too far and pushed back. And I was lucky enough to have people stand beside me when it mattered." She never talked about the nightmares, about the way she sometimes woke up in the middle of the night, gasping, seeing Granger's face in the darkness, about the guilt she carried for the people who'd died. That was hers to carry. But she also never regretted what she'd done, because the alternative, living on her knees, watching her daughter grow up in fear, was worse than any nightmare. The valley prospered in the years that followed. New families moved in, businesses grew. The council became a permanent institution, ensuring that no one person could ever hold the kind of power Granger had wielded. And at the center of it all, Abigail and Wade built a life that was ordinary and extraordinary all at once. They had 2 more children, boys who grew up strong and wild. They expanded the ranch, added cattle, built a reputation for honesty and hard work. They argued and made up and learned how to navigate the complicated terrain of building a life together. And every year, on the anniversary of the battle, they rode out to the graves and laid flowers and remembered. Clara grew into a woman who was fierce and principled, shaped by the knowledge that her mother had fought for her and won. She became a teacher, then a judge, then eventually a representative to the territorial legislature. And when she had children of her own, she told them the story of their grandmother, the widow who refused to be broken, the woman who stood up to a tyrant and won, not because she was special, not because she was fearless, but because she believed that some things were worth fighting for, even when the cost was high. That was Abigail Mercer's legacy. Not the violence, not the bloodshed, not the dramatic showdown in the burned ruins of her ranch, but the quiet daily choice to keep standing, to keep building, to keep believing that ordinary people, when they stand together, can change the world. And in the end, that was the most revolutionary thing of all.